Just want to remind those of you who are listening or watching along that we really want to hear from you. So on the call bridge, and if you don't see it, it's the number that's right below the web screen. Hit *1 and you'll get in our question queue, and we'll be able to loop you in. So I said before the lunch break that I think it'd be good to focus on scope. But before we go there, I know that some of you had some very good conversations over lunch and managed to come up with some new ideas, perhaps. So I thought I'd do a quick check and see if there's anyone who wants to add something new to the table that hasn't been raised yet that we should fold into our conversation moving forward this afternoon. Yes, and can you remind us who you are?
Sebastian Benthal, NYU, Center for Cybersecurity. We've been talking a lot about like a bill of materials kind of document or format, and then we've been talking about, okay, what about process? What about like business processes? And at one point that came up in conversation over lunch is that, you know, you can have any syntax for a document that you want, but the semantics really depend on the process that generates it and the processes that consume it. And so really we're talking about the same thing. If we're standardizing processes, then we're immediately talking about like automation, scalability, and so there's no contradiction there. And the other thing I want to say is just to contribute to, you know, the metaphor wars. Personally, I'm anti-metaphor, and so the whole concept of a bill of materials for software, which is the most immaterial thing that we could think of, is already getting us into weird analogical territory. And if software is a result of, you know, a human production process, if software is people, if software is process, you know, it's going to be process all the way down and all the way up. I just wanted to note that.
And I really like the term you coined of the metaphor wars. Where were you? On the phone, we have Jeffrey Snover from Microsoft.
Howdy, can you hear me?
We can indeed. Thanks for joining the conversation.
Excellent. Yeah, great. Howdy, I'm Jeffrey Snover. I'm a technical fellow at Microsoft, and I really have 2 points I want to make. First is Microsoft and all the other vendors in the industry are stakeholders in the success and protection of our customers and our communities. So I think this software bill of material effort is very, very important. The second is, as technical fellow, I've been chief architect for both products and platforms. And there's a difference, and I think that difference is relevant to this conversation. With products, we deliver solutions. But with platforms, the goal is to enable a set of solutions that can be delivered by others and can be delivered by an ecosystem of others. And so when it comes to the software bill of materials, I really view it as a platform because it does not deliver safety, it enables safety. And it does so by allowing others to integrate information like vulnerability assessments. And what this does is it then empowers the people that have those software components. It empowers them to become safe. It allows them to identify potential risks and then potential strategies to remediate or address those risks. Some of those solutions might be, I'm going to buy product A versus product B, but more likely it's things like I'm going to press that vendor for a patch or implement a compensating security control. There's lots of stuff that isn't going to be patched, vendors that have gone out of business, et cetera. But you can still, if you know what your risks are, you can often address those risks through compensating controls, firewall rules, disconnecting things, ensuring you've got good auditing, et cetera. So those are the 2 points I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Any other observations, ideas, thoughts that you've had over the last hour that you want to put on the table as we work towards thinking about scoping? All right. What I want to do is pull up a slide that Jim offered earlier that I think was a very good scoping. And means we're not going to have the notes taken live, and that'll give me an opportunity also to thank Megan Dosher. For those of you who don't know, Megan Dosher is part of the cybersecurity team at NTIA, and she does a lot of the national security work that hopefully you don't know about, but has also been very instrumental in our multi-stakeholder processes. And this might be a useful straw man for thinking about sort of the scoping question and the definitional question. And whenever we're talking about security, people also, and we talked about this earlier, I can't remember who raised it, but this notion that there's going to be context-specific issues, perhaps things that are where the risks are a little greater, we may need to think about it slightly differently, or it could be useful to have a single notion that spans most of the sectors. And so wanted to turn it over to the body to say, does this graphic, if we're saying, when we talk about, what is a bill of materials, what do we want it to be? Can we use this to sort of drill down on where you would like this to land? Kent.
Well, since I want to make this as focused as possible, I personally would like to have it include all third-party external components to the vendor's products. It's sort of in between the all and attack surface relevant components type of thing, but I do believe all of the time issues there are viable, doable, and necessary, and should be included, as well as the breadth issues of the naming and the component related information. I think component naming is going to be the harder part of this. The automated format's not going to be as hard as everybody thinks it's going to be.
It's a great point that the component naming, and we were talking about this a little over the break, is a problem that both SWID and SPDX share, that everyone sort of has this challenge. Yes, there was a...
I just had a comment that the 1-inch cube with the first 3 itself is somewhere we are not right now. Getting there would be like a step forward for us to even do coordinated vulnerability disclosure or understand vulnerabilities of a larger product that has sub-products. So starting at the, if treat each one of those as 1 inch, the first 1-inch cube to cover itself would be a huge progress that where we are today.
Great. JC?
I think that in breadth, there's this business of dependencies that are not components. So if you want to install this particular application, you also need to be running, or it requires, and they're not necessarily folded up under, but they are prerequisites for. And so I guess there's a question about, what are those kind of associated applications, packages, or infrastructure pieces, because people can update their core software, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee they're updating the Apache that's running alongside it. And so I think that's one of those discontinuities that creates gotchas. So how do you understand this stuff on a system level, not just on an application level?
Can you make this concrete for us? And I'm going to speak out.
I would say kind of associated dependencies, or dependencies that are not components.
Are we talking compiler flags and things like that, or?
You may need a particular database, right? So SQL, right? So there are and especially in a web services architecture, there are components that are necessary to be present in the same system. And so I don't know how we really deal with that, because people can have an initial install when they buy something, but then they may only update the core application. So there's all this peripheral stuff that's a dependency that it needs to be understood as part of the same system. And I don't know how to deal with that. but it's definitely something that should be part of the situational awareness of what you're dealing with.
Josh.
So I'm really intrigued by this model. It makes me want to go dig up some old notes. There's some parts of it that are snagging me and I can't put my finger on it. I was going to propose that maybe a working group would be to flesh out like a turn of the crank 2 to something like this. But I'm also intrigued at something you said about what's the unit of response time. So something like what's in it probably needs to be more standardized across sectors, but maybe how often you do it as a way you differentiate yourself is the maturity level. This is one of the ways they rate hosting centers is like, can you do a patch in production, patch with downtime, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to codify this as truth at a glance. I'm snagged on a couple things. I will say, though, that known vulnerabilities tend to adhere to versions as opposed to, this idea of a component name ID. Licenses adhere to project. Vulnerabilities adhere to versions, discrete versions. So there may be natural ones. And when I said let's do a survey of existing practice at banks or in regulated industries, one of the reasons is I bet you we can map a heat map as to which altitude on all three of those existing practices live on.
Tom, you had two fingers.
I wonder if there's room, this is thinking out loud, but I wonder if there's room for trade-offs along this space such that if you cannot, for whatever reason, provide minor version information or patch level information, you then should provide snippets for comparison purposes. An edge case that has come up in discussion was the vulnerability that ended up being traced back to Stack Overflow answer. So it had been copied and pasted into who knows how many projects throughout the world.
Further thoughts on scoping. What do we mean when we say Sbomb? Jim, this is your slide. Can I put you on the spot and say, would you draw a volume on this space?
Yeah, I would, picking up on what Josh said, I think it may actually be that two of the dimensions get fixed and the third dimension is the one that's allowed to vary. And I think Josh was suggesting that perhaps it was the time dimension. And that might be a useful model for us to work on.
Great. Kent.
Okay, so just so I'm understanding here, the time dimension from a vendor perspective is when I publish software. So when I send something out, I make a change to my software, I should update that file for whatever reason right then and there so that there's an accurate depiction of what's on that system when it's installed or in that package when it's delivered. So from that perspective, at a patch, when a patch occurs, yes, absolutely. Any updates of any type, a hot fix or the like, yeah, absolutely. At a major version change or a minor version change, absolutely. That's not real time, but accurate reflection of what I'm putting on that device.
Just to clarify.
Sorry, 1, 2?
Okay. Yeah, I just want to respond to that point.
Mm-hmm. Same thing.
I think that the time dimension isn't necessarily when the vendor makes the change. It's when the vendor makes the Sbomb available to the world.
Well, from the standpoint of at least how I've been looking at this, Sbombs are created as part of your build process. Right. It's not something that is different and distinct. So there is included in the package that goes to the customer. It is included. There's multiple potentials here. One for what's in the install package, and then what's in the deployed package on the machine. So you could actually have two Sbombs on a machine, one that is more holistic and one that is runtime. And as such, they may have slightly different information in them, but that Sbomb goes the same time the product goes to the disk.
We've got 1, 2, 3.
All right, and I should have been clear. If you remember I don't even know if they have it handy, but if you remember my 3 columns, like the inventory itself, is a build time thing, and basically the cadence that Philips does for their MDS2 reports is every time new software is pushed, a new Sbomb is pushed. So it's a release cadence. Column 3, though, is like they've done some sort of triage to say, here's the known vulnerabilities, and they don't want to update that in real time because new CVEs are reported every day. So he's opting for a quarterly refresh of his column 3 risk attestation, but he doesn't even have to do that one at all because this is the voluntary best practices for column 1, which is the inventory of parts, not necessarily column 3 of a triage of the potentially exploitable vulnerabilities.
Right. If we are able to sort of specifically focus on the Sbomb itself and the transparency from the vendors, then we can build a lot of tools on top of that information that will be beyond just vulnerability focused. I can see support issues as well. If somebody has a problem, tell me what's in your Sbomb file. Run this little program that shows you exactly what's in the file. Makes it easy for support instead of trying to dig out from the customer what it is that they're actually running on their network or trying to find contracts to make sure they have the right information.
Jen?
Jen Ellis from Rapid7. I have probably shocked the shit out of most people in this room by being quiet so far today.
And for those of you who are curious, the favorite did win.
I'm sorry,
Jen Ellis,
absolutely.
The first person to swear on a federal government
Anybody
podcast.
who bet against that, more fool you. So I have a question that's probably a stupid question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because I'm apparently here to embarrass myself. Do people issue release notes? Is that a thing that people do, or is that just Rapid7? Other people put out release notes when they put out an update to their product, generally speaking? I guess my question then is, why is this not just part of the release notes process? Like, providing that update is not just a standard part of that process?
A good question. I'm going to give Kent a very quick answer, and then we'll go over to another vendor.
Well, the release notes are human readable, and they're not formatted and structured, and we want machine readable so that we can automate for vulnerability management tools or other security automation capabilities.
Bruce, and just as a reminder, if you're listening on the call bridge, hit *1 to join our conversation. Our operator is sitting by.
I would agree with the release notes, just to answer that part. But the point I wanted to bring up was that there's deployment options that happen on many software, and a lot of these things won't get deployed. And if you want to know so for instance, you may have the Swedish language version instead of the English language version of something, and only the Swedish language version is vulnerable. So part of this has to have something to do with the deployment options. And there's many products, or some products at least, where you can install different versions, and it'll pick up different versions in the same source to get you there. And I think Java was that way at one time, for example. So that's a consideration if we're going to be comprehensive here. Something that should be put in.
I have a two-fingered response. I have two-fingered response.
To unify, I guess, that comment and the release notes machine readability comment. It would be really good to create some either carrot or stick or best practice that release notes actually are machine readable, because the only way to resolve that deployment issue, right, is to have some kind of explicit and formal description of, some vulnerability in some deployment in a machine readable way, so that people who are parsing machine readable release notes can understand what's what. And it would be of tremendous benefit. And so as we talk about formats, beyond SWID and SPDEs, can we come up from an industry perspective with some kind of shared understanding of what a machine readable set of release notes looks like, so that customers can act on that information more efficiently?
CSAF.
Sorry, can you? Is that just a one-off, or was that just something that we should have on the record?
There's standard formats for security advisories that could easily be leveraged into that type of thing. That's a bigger push for vendors to update, I think, and most people to do. Release notes historically have not been in any specific format. I don't disagree with you. I think it'd be a great thing if we all started using it. But I think that's beyond the scope of what we're trying to talk here.
Chris?
Yeah, so we especially with the release notes, we're talking about on-premise software where you're shipping, delivering something to a customer. What about SaaS? What about an API? Most people who, and this is where you get to the real DevOps world, right? When you have an API, you're updating every day. One day I'm a consumer of that API. I might be vulnerable because of a component there. The next day I'm not. Yeah, so I just don't think the release notes model fits in to that world.
And you just put something new that I don't think we've talked about, which is non-on-prem software.
He did have it on his slide as
sorry.
something to talk about.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about here, it's already a fairly common practice to include links to, for example, your bug tracker that has the list of all the issues, and that may actually be dynamic anyway, and it's out there for posterity, for somebody to come back and take a look at what was actually fixed in this particular version, right? So in that sense, the bug tracker issue is basically machine generated at the time you want to produce it. If you have a system that's producing the bill of materials, and you should, for all the reasons we talked about, attaching that to your otherwise human curated release notes should be a no-brainer, just something you're basically already doing.
Yes.
So going back to my earlier comment of starting with the inch cube is really, if you did start with the very minimum of all 3 dimensions, doing time dimension on a live is not very difficult. I feel like, if you started with something very basic, just saying, can I query this software today to find out what components have been added as a differential should be very difficult, not very difficult. And so I feel like if you start with something very basic like that to target, the time dimension is one of the easiest one to solve. You can always create, if you had a template, say whatever XML looking template or JSON, whichever, I'm not going to get into that argument, but you get into some format and then you're able to online query it to find out. You can solve the SAS problems, the past problems, all of them by live querying to find out what is the version of today's, all the components.
So this is, keep this data at some fixed point server side on the vendor's, and the vendor's website?
I'm saying give interfaces to query this on every software that you deliver. You have all the components already identified now. Just give a way to update it on that software if only one component was updated. When you query it, you basically get all the information about OpenSSL version is this much higher than where you started.
Bruce?
I think we should decide if we're going to limit this to on-premise or not. I mean, if we're gonna do both, they're very different, and I think we'll make a lot more progress if we go with on-premise and then later maybe extend that to cloud or whatever you want to talk about. If you're going to do cloud, you should be able to just have an online API that says, "Give me my inventory of what I'm running," but that's a long ways from where we're at right now.
Important scoping question.
I have to agree, Bruce. I think it makes it easier and better for us to focus and make some successes first and then move past that.
All right, focus on on-prem. I want to allow someone to argue and say we should include the scope of having SAS Cloud, something in that space. Anyone who wants to sort of argue and say that we should try to include that?
Well, the world is hybrid, right? Like, your IoT device talks to the cloud, your mobile app talks to the cloud. Like, the majority of development these days is both. So I don't know how you can just ignore, the back end that might have a vulnerability that's exposed through an on-premise piece.
The cloud native companies are also much more like Sunil was suggesting, where this is a byproduct of their SDL. And I was whispering to him, like microservices, where these complex mashups where you don't even architect the software, it's just some interactions. They could machine generate their machine readable bill of materials.
Okay. Yes.
Thinking about cloud software as a service stuff might get us into the headspace of imagining Sbombs as like a process automated dynamic thing as opposed to a static thing in the first place, and that might elevate the discussion.
Okay, thank you. That's a good point. I want to go to the phone. Steve?
Hi, Steve Springett. I'm one of the project leads over at OWASP, and I just wanted to make a few points that I think in order for an Sbomb specification to be successful, I think it needs to be simple. We really need to make this effort successful in the free and open source community. We want it to be adoptable. I think we want it to be expandable and let the commercial vendors innovate and compete on their differentiators. Initially, I think we really should keep the focus very narrow. I also want to, I'm not a big fan of the Sbomb because, as we've heard earlier, there are vulnerable hardware, and hardware is shipped with IoT devices. And I think that should be part of our vernacular.
Sorry, the comment you missed was you may have helped coin the term H-bomb, and I think there was consensus that we should avoid that one.
I agree. And my third point is really about being lifecycle agnostic, and whatever specification we come up with, I think really needs to have a decentralized scope as really part of its core.
Those are fantastic points. I am not seeing folks, other than the point that understanding cloud development practices is going to be useful, not a lot of people seem to be saying that we want to, from the start, actively try to include non-on-prem software. And I think one way to cleanly divide that is if there are folks who are interested in off-prem cloud SaaS stack things, that can be a particular separate working group. That's great. I think that's a great way to make progress. But I'm getting the sense that for the folks who are emphasizing, let's do this from a proof of concept, start with the easy things first, we'll focus on on-prem software, as well as some IoT component or medical device component. Further thoughts on that? Please, but can I request you put your mic on?
Can, but it's sort of like irrelevant. I just was going to ask if we could see the list on the screen.
Great. We're going to go back to the notes. Okay, thank you. No, that is the, yes. Eric, will you introduce yourself?
Eric Winger from Cisco. So I was going to say that if you are going to accept this idea, which I think makes sense, of starting small testing and then seeing what's valuable and moving forward, there was a comment earlier on about trying to figure out what problems you're going to try to solve. So I think that figuring out if there's a core problem that you think you can solve with this kind of an approach, testing it, and then seeing whether there are other places that it makes sense to expand that model and to use it in other places to solve similar problems.
Good point. All right, yes.
I was going to say, I think focusing on the on-prem first as opposed to the cloud, I think helps clarify why I think most of the room really wants to do this, which is when you receive something from someone else, you don't inherently know what's inside it. And so that bill of materials or the food label helps you understand the ingredients. Whereas if you had the ingredients for the cloud and it's buried way down inside, what are you as a consumer going to do with it anyway? Hopefully, the team running that service actually has it and is responding accordingly. And I think that's the difference between these two cases here.
You want to respond, and then we'll go to Jennings, and then we'll go to the phone.
Yeah, I mean, which I think comes back to why you're trying to figure out what problem you're trying to solve. Because if you have to need to know who would find this information useful before you decide that it's worth trying to produce that information and push it out to somebody.
Jennings, who would find this information useful?
I would. So I think part of this is also, as a customer or potential customer of a company, understanding their basic security hygiene. So even if it doesn't help me with incident response and vulnerability management in my data centers, I want to know that SaaS provider actually, gives a rip about, security and actually documents these things. So there's a host of reasons. There's a whole lifecycle management piece that has to be kind of considered.
Great. First, I want to go to Jeffrey Snover on the phone, and then we'll go to Kent. Jeffrey?
Howdy. Yeah, I wanted to say I think the conversation about on-premise, hybrid, cloud is actually masking the deeper issue. I think the deeper issue is supplier, deployer, securer, and then consumer. And I think where it makes, I'll just highlight, I think the idea of like a software bill of materials from someone who's supplying something gets delivered to someone who then consumes it, deploys it, and is responsible for securing it. That's one set of issues. When you then say that same information should be exposed to the people who consume it, whether it's the user of an application or the consumer of a microservice, et cetera, I think that's a very different set of issues and much more fuzzy and complicated and really quite an order of magnitude more difficult.
Thank you. I've got a two-finger from Art, and then over to Ken.
Seems to me if we're going to get as far as producing the Sbomb, providing it to anyone is pretty much trivial at that point. So I'm not sure we need to worry about the distinction as to what anyone's role is. You have it, you can make use of it, or not, basically.
Yeah, Kent.
What he said.
We have Kimberly on the phone.
I think that the comments that have been made about scoping and the problems we're trying to solve are right on the money. And in that sense, is a software bill of materials to inform customers of zlib in their word processor. They can't update zlib. They can only update the word processor. Like, how much benefit is there in that? While on the other hand, we have a very, very clear benefit to the car manufacturer who bought a piece of technology, integrated it into the car. They need to know what's in that technology. Me as the car owner, I don't need to know that there's a component in that entertainment system, but the car manufacturer does. And I think those are some of these scenarios that the software bill of materials is most beneficial to defenders in, and is easiest to potentially test in the smaller scope. It does meet the sort of on-prem. It is very specific health and safety related, and then we can take our best practices from that to how can we expand that further. Cars, healthcare, whatever you were talking about. I think supply chain is a really, really compelling argument for software bill of materials. If we're using software bill of materials to basically push vendors to level up their security maturity for third-party components, I think we're using a hammer when we need a screwdriver, and we're taking one tool to solve an underlying problem around what's the tooling, what's the update patterns, what's the vendor culture and responsibility and hygiene around these third-party components that they're delivering to customers. And I think there's other tools we can apply there.
We have thank you. We have a response in the room?
Right. So I think we want to be careful not to follow the slippery slope of saying users can't defend. I think, in the case of the hospital, the legacy device, knowing that there's a vulnerability there, you may be able to sandbox it and still safely use it. That's clearly not the case in every example, but that wouldn't be a reason not to provide it.
It's a great point. Yes.
I think that we just need to make sure we distinguish who the user is, because the user is both the secure and the consumer, right? And just to use another metaphor, you have a food manufacturer, you have the grocer who wants to have organic foods, you have the parent that buys it, and you have the kid that consumes it. The kid does not care what the ingredients are for a bag of potato chips, but the parent does. So I think in this case, it's really ending at the secure. The bill of materials is probably most relevant for the secure, but the consumer's not going to care. They're both users, though.
Steve Lipner on the phone.
Thank you. I'm sort of running behind here because trying to watch the video and then which runs about 10 minutes behind the audio from my phone, and then by the time I get called, there have been 4 or 5 more comments since I hit the request. I think the usage scenarios are the critical piece to understanding what ought to be done in this bill of materials space, assuming something ought to. I mean, and I've heard things all the way from understanding the supplier's process and getting convinced that the supplier actually has a security process, through a user organization being able to defend themselves in certain scenarios, to maybe I'm not sure I really heard individual users defending themselves, but I suppose that's a possibility, or at least gaining confidence. And I think being explicit about what the objectives is just what the objectives are, just super important to deciding what needs to be done, if anything. And one other point, I guess two other points. One of them, a developer, producer ought to have command of their third-party components as part of building a secure product. There are lots more about things to do about building a secure product, but that's sort of a must in today's world. But getting that confidence may not require releasing a bill of materials, as long as the developer has it and is actually using it to stay on top of what's happening with his components, and patch them or replace them or stop using them as necessary when something goes wrong. Sorry for the long-winded response.
No, thank you. I appreciate that, and forgive me for citing you in this, but Steve Lipner and SafeCode actually have a fantastic and fairly brief document on tracking third-party components in the software development process that, if you haven't seen, is a great resource. So we've been talking a little bit about scope, and I got a sense that there's we can have some simplification and some targeting by looking at on-prem. I know there are a number of people here who are very concerned about medical devices and perhaps by extension have some expertise in the broader class of embedded systems. Do we see that these are compatible to think about on-premise software and software that's on devices? Are these things that we can think about at the same time?
I fear if we don't, you might end up with the very thing we want to avoid, which is two incompatible formats.
Yep.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything that would exclude medical devices or any other devices from the conversation we're having.
Excellent. So this is, I think we heard this morning that we needed to think a lot about scoping. I'm hearing that at least, we want to start small. We want to take advantage of existing tools, and maybe it's time to open that particular can, see what's inside, for existing tools. And now I'm going to call out Kent, if he wants to. I don't want to I'm putting you on the spot, but you can decline, and talk a little about how you've thought about the existing tools and standards that we have.
Okay, well, I'm not going to make the open source folks happy. The reality is a lot of what we've been looking at is to use what we leverage and what we can leverage right now in our build processes. One of the things that we don't want to do as a community is try to leverage a lot of heavyweight kind of processes on vendors, because the reality is they probably won't adopt them. And adoption is critical to this kind of solution. CPE was not a good approach to naming devices, mainly because it required the vendors to actually do something that was out of their processes. It meant they had to send that information to a central location, NIST, and then have that information incorporated into the NVD-related information. That never really was successful. So we want to really look at how vendors themselves, software producers, I'm a vendor, so I say vendors as I mean the software development community, to really put this as part of their integration in their build process. So when you're doing something, regardless of what we do here, it comes out as an automatic artifact of a normal build environment. It's then up to the software producer to decide whether they want to ship it to somebody or not. That's a different story. But they should have a standard format, machine-readable format that is incorporated into their build processes, so this information is actually developed. The one that we have is SWID today, because we use SWID today. Other large vendors do as well. Even some smaller vendors do as well. Not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying it's the end-all, be-all. It's not. But when I talk to the developers about what it would take to incorporate component information, they said it'd take 5 printfs. That tells me that they're not too concerned about how this is going to be added into an existing mechanism that many vendors have, although most are still learning how to spell it. But I think whatever we're looking at, whether it's SPDX, whether it's SWID, we need to come up with something that is reasonably adoptable, reasonably deployable, and reasonably lightweight. Because the reality is, we're not going to have the luxury of coming up with something that's going to require vendors to re-implement their build processes.
Great. I'm going to go to the phone first and loop in Steve, because I think he's going to talk a little about the open source perspective. And I also just want to make it clear that this in the room today is probably not going to be where we resolve standards fights, but I think it's useful to help us understand the scope of the landscape and see whether this is something that we can address or at least tee up for fairly straightforward machine translation. Steve.
Yeah, thanks. So I also looked at SWID, and I also looked at SPDX, and there's definitely some support for SPDX, especially in the open source community. SWID just really isn't really mentioned too much for various reasons. But as an OWASP person, I'm interested in security and open source. And I didn't see anything out there. So about a year ago, I actually created a quote-unquote specification called Cyclone DX, and it's open source. It's my interpretation of what a lightweight bill of materials specification could be, and it does support applications, libraries, frameworks. It supports hardware. Being able to specify those as well as licenses, and it absolutely can be, integrated into builds. There's a Node module. There's a Maven plugin. There's support for other things coming in the future. But regardless of the specification, I think the open source community is definitely open to trying to help and assist with a lightweight bomb specification, whether it's Cyclone DX or something brand new is irrelevant. But one thing that could be very useful, whichever specification we come up with, is really the package URL specification. So what Cyclone DX does, for example, is it actually includes the package URL as part of the native specification. And because it actually does integrate with Node and Maven and all these other ecosystems, it uses those ecosystems' native package managers to standardize what the resulting package URL could be. And I think that's really, really important when we start to care about where these components come from, and how can I then query those components repositories to get out-of-date component information, for example. So I think there really is an interest in the open source community. I know there's many organizations that have already adopted Cyclone DX. Whether it's good or bad is relevant, but I think there's a lot of interest in doing some kind of work in the open source community, and I'd be more than happy to help with that initiative.
Excellent. We will almost certainly be taking you up on that. We've got Brian, and then we've got Todd on the phone.
Right. So in responding to Kent, I think I'm going to end up amplifying a lot of what Steve just said. But, you mentioned the CPE largely failed because it required other people to do stuff, which is really, apply a new name that wasn't native to what they were already doing. This is still largely a problem within the C, C++ ecosystem that have, really old build systems, really old and reliable. I did that a long time ago. But any of the build systems that have come along since like 2004, this is just a native thing. Every build system is already using very specific deterministic coordinates for how they select and manage their dependencies. And so really there's no extra process required in those modern build systems to produce this bill of materials. And further, we need to make sure that whatever coordinate system we use is precise enough to carry the very vulnerability data that we're after. That's one of the fundamental problems with the CPE, is that it can't. And any of the other ones that we end up having to map to probably will have the same problem. The only way to be absolutely deterministic is to use the native coordinate systems of the various packages, and something like Perl actually is a great wrapper on top of that.
All right, we've got Todd on the phone, and then Jim in the room, and then Taki on the phone.
Ooh.
Hey, Todd, we can hear you.
Oh, perfect. Cool. So I just wanted to throw out there, there are a lot of approaches to finding components and listing those all out. I mean, honestly, as a defender or just as someone who does asset management, for all my IoT stuff, if I could just get something super duper basic, like an OS version and a minor number, and just kind of leave it at that, if I had just that, that would be head and shoulders above where I'm at today, right? I know we're all, we all have some passing familiarity with vulnerability management and doing deep scans and knowing which version of zlib you have and OpenSSH and all that. But if I just knew that this hunk of IoT had Windows XP on it, that's a fantastic starting point, and it's something we don't really have today. So I'm wondering if it would be useful to start with something terribly basic like that and then kind of go from there, or if we really need to solve all the problems first with component versioning, or if I'm just being very lazy.
Can start small. Jim.
Yeah, so this may be one area where there's a difference between software vendors and device vendors, because much of the information that's necessary from a bill of material for a device doesn't come out of the build process. It comes out of the platform that the system is built upon, because that's included as part of the product.
That's very helpful. So perhaps the person who has lost the most sleep and is talking to us from the furthest, Taki from Panasonic, who I believe is talking to us from Japan.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, no problem. I just wanted to add to Kent's point, I guess, on the lightweight part, and I apologize if somebody already said this, but lightweight as in easy for vendors like us to implement, but lightweight so that it's small enough that it can fit into small devices, especially the IoT devices that don't have a lot of memory or storage space. Something that I believe is very important.
That is a fantastic point, and one of the challenges that we're having this conversation without one of the experts in this field, Dave Waltermeyer from NIST, because he's up at the IETF working on this issue, but Kent can speak to what he's working on.
Well, one of the things that's being developed in the IETF right now is a specification called CoSWID, which is uses a CBOR kind of a approach. It takes the text out and makes all the attribute textual indices, so it greatly reduces the amount of size that a SWID file would have to be for resource-constrained devices.
Great, thank you. Josh, did you have a comment?
I almost said this earlier, and I wish Eric hadn't stepped out for a sec. Cisco pushed in IETF a completely different standard called MUD, Manufacturer Usage Description, and it's, oh, there he is. Basically, the minimum viable product for it is an IoT device would advertise this is the port I'm going to speak on and the domain I'm going to speak to. And if you ever see me talking to anybody else, it's anomaly detection baseline, right? You must be misbehaving. That's really lightweight. When I saw it, I was kind of encouraged because with these low capacity, low energy devices that may not want to store a lot, one could use such a protocol to say, oh, by the way, here's a web reference to my most recent software bill of materials. So you can interrogate devices, take dynamic network security configurations. So it's not in mud right now, but I think it's from Cisco's offering. They're not the only ones on it, but it's a decent idea for these lower cost, lower hygiene, lower compute power devices. You want to add to that, Eric?
I will circle back with Elliot Lear, who was the original author of the standard, and suggest to him and see what he thinks. So yeah.
So Brian, I'm going to get to you in a moment, but first I want to go to Kate Stewart from the Linux Foundation, who's on the phone. Kate, you're on the air.
Hi, thanks, guys. I've been following the webinar as I can today, and I have heard a couple comments about SPDX. And so just wanted to clarify a couple of things I heard. Specifically, the package URL specification is going into SPDX in the next version as well. There's something there right now that's sort of the same purpose, but we thought this package URL is a cleaner story. So we're lining up behind that as well. And we've been also looking back and forth with SWID, and there are certain elements of interoperability between the two. And there's a lot of use cases that are out there. And so if people are interested, I'm happy to provide more information about where we are currently with the specification and the adoption of it.
That's fantastic. I think, actually, could you give us the minute and a half to 2 minute summary of what the adoption space looks like, what some of the recent challenges you guys have solved?
Sure. Right now, we've gotten very widespread adoption of the SPDX license identifiers as a way of summarizing common licenses. And most of the package managers out there, as well as packages themselves, are using them at the file level as well as at the package level. It's been standardized on in some of the Europeans to put identifiers into the source code so that people can machine detect things accurately. We are working on cleaning up the Linux kernel to be to have its licensing cleaned up and using SPDX identifiers, so that eventually we can just go grep and actually get an accurate representation of what licensing is there at the file level. The SPDX specification has a way of capturing the CPEs in it right now. So if you want to do a cross-link into the security databases and look up your CVEs and CWEs, you can use the CPE ID. There's no problem with adding the SWID, the SWID IDs into there as well for doing cross-lookup and doing correlation. So these use cases can all be handled. I did a lot of studying a couple years ago with SWID. The reason that the open source community has not understood it or embraced it is because the specification is behind a pay-for firewall. And that has been part of the problem, I think. The SPDX specification is all open, but it was very hard for people to get to, and it looked complicated on initial views. So these are all things that need to be improved. So whatever mechanisms come out, making sure that it is very easy for people in companies as well as people on the open source communities to pick up and work from and generate to. We have open source tooling now able to produce and consume SPDX documents, and so the interchange is finally starting to happen. There has been various tool vendors in the space that do security as well as doing license analysis and specific component analysis, able to generate SPDX documents. Let's see, what else has been going on that you guys are going to be interested in?
I think this has been an excellent overview, and it was very helpful to hear that there are a lot of problems that are currently in the process of being addressed. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We have Brian in the room.
Yeah, good timing. I'll go on the record and say I think that's fantastic news that SPDX is adopting Perl. It may turn out to be a watershed moment for the adoption of that format because they provide a standardized way of machine interoperating with it. But I wanted to go back to something a couple callers had said, starting with something super basic, and I wanted to provide some caution on that. We see this a lot in the cases of tools that do basically name-based matching, and that it looks like I'm using struts, right? But struts actually exists with 70 individual submodules, and clearly not every vulnerability affects every single one equally. And so if you're not careful, going too basic to a point that you can't be precise enough about the thing that you're using is or is not, in fact, in your software, exacerbates one of the points made earlier, which is all those people are calling you, asking you to fix this thing, when in fact it's not even actually present in the software you're using.
It's a really good point. Further thoughts about this? Katie.
Apologies if I missed this in Chris Weisopel's presentation this morning, but I've heard him mention this before about it going so granular, as to then needing to track what mitigations may be in place in addition. So I just wanted to say that, as we go forward with this, which it seems like it is going forward, that whatever level of complexity we choose, we have to appreciate the fact that just knowing what the component is not in and of itself an indicator of vulnerability.
I have a question on what she's saying.
What I'm going to suggest what we do is I want to wrap up this discussion about formats and existing tools, and then we'll go to the next higher level to exist some of the challenges. And there's one issue that I think there are two things that we've talked about, and I think it'd be useful to clarify in this room how tightly bound they are. We've talked about the formats, and I'm very heartened to hear both from Kate and Kent that there's going to be, seems like the SPDX and SWID play fairly well together, or there's a strong potential they might. And is format separate from namespace? Right? The namespace problem, I know a bunch of us have mentioned, it's a known hard problem. Perl seems like a very good tool to go forward. We have common platform enumeration, things like that. Can we decouple to solve separately the format issue and the namespace issue? Brian.
I think that's exactly what we're seeing with Perl and SPDX. SPDX is the format, Perl is the namespace.
Great. Further thoughts on sort of the existing tool side of things? Josh.
I said this in passing earlier, but Java's GAV's very good coordinate system and very adhered to. Some other languages are very loosey-goosey. I almost think it's useful for us to flag, I was whispering like prime directive type stuff, like do they have warp capability, for certain organizations. I wonder if there's obviously some languages and some environments are going to be more challenging and less challenging for this kind of approach. I mean, most of the financial services stuff is, modern languages, but some of the older ones can get really ugly.
Anyone who has specific knowledge? Yes.
I just want to point out also all the static code analysis outputs that come out. Why are they not in this format already? Maybe Veracode.
If only we had some vendors who specialized about this in the room.
Or is there a reason for a different format for them? Or is it something that can be built into anybody who's building software to have this static code analysis, like an open
So I don't think it's exactly this. It's not really the same thing, because, I mean, static code analysis is typically giving like a CWE, the class of the vulnerability, and then a location, and it doesn't know anything about the version or the name of something. It typically has like a binary file or source file, but there's no versioning typically.
The category that Analyst Track is software composition analysis with all the vendors in that. There's quite a few in the room. They don't even spit out in the same format per se, and a lot of the financial services guys wanted them to. But what they all say when you push on them is, well, we're waiting for a standard to emerge, and it's just a different output format for us. Yeah.
And I think that is a great way to sort of tie up. It sounds like this group could put together a working group that tackles sort of this basic model of using SWID and SPDX and what that looks like for this transparency document. Does that sound like something that we would want to have a working group that was focused on using what was in front of us today to get that basic level? Okay, we'll come back to that later when we start to people out what the outputs be. But now I think it's important that we address some of the challenges that we talked about this morning, that a number of you have raised, of how do we think through some of the complexities of using this data? Is there a metadata channel that we want to think through and start to explore? Is there guidance that we want to give to vendors, customers, organizations, security tool providers? What does the path look like to sort of addressing some of these very real challenges? We have on the phone Kate Stewart.
Yeah, I just want to say that I'd be delighted to be able to participate in trying to get this SWID and SPDX working together and try to get this direction happening. I think it's a really positive one.
I think I've just got a wave from Kent, so you guys may be the co-chairs of that working group, given your respective leadership. So we appreciate your enthusiasm, and we will punish you for it.
Excellent. Thank you.
But now I want to talk to some of the things. Oh, Chris.
So just back on the data format, I think this is maybe what Katie was getting at. The idea that there's a standardized, column, if you will, of whether you're vulnerable or not, an assertion by the vendor that you're vulnerable or not. Like, when you end of life the product, you'd like to end of life it with the, the Sbomb and all the components and what the final disposition is with those, at that point in time. Is the idea that this format would have that information in it, the vulnerability-ness or not?
The vulnerability-ness. I think, go ahead.
A two-finger on that. I mean, I put that in my slide. I just didn't show it too much. One of the working groups I would love to either participate in or even help run, especially because I have to do this, is for some, and Bruce and I were talking about this as well, some of my older products, you might have to use an older version of an API. You can't update it. So there's going to be some sort of residual, I think was the phrase I used in my slide. So one of the questions I have is, how do you maintain your list of residuals and dispositions across stakeholders and across time? Because the interval that you update them, what's an acceptable answer? Do you have to substantiate your answer? Becomes a real operational problem for software producers. And for this to scale beyond a zero vulnerability bill of materials every time, which isn't feasible in all cases, we need to have a way to persist those dispositions across time and stakeholder.
Would this cover Rob's point from earlier about backporting as well?
Maybe. I'd have to hear it again.
So the issue with backporting is that you're now unsupported. You got some older software, as you say, that we can't support it anymore. Well, we're still supporting it. It's just we can't upgrade to the new version, but we can apply this patch to the bug, to a known vulnerability. So we are still using the older version, and it's out of support of the original vendor, but we've applied a patch to it, and so now it's fixed and it's no longer vulnerable.
Not that anyone here has ever bought or sold their house, but there's usually a list of things that have to be disclosed and are accepted, and there's a punch list, and there's going to be some remainder and residual for software too.
So, but that there's no standard format for that. There's no version numbers. There's no way across vendors. Like 5 vendors have applied this patch, and there's 6 names for it.
This house may contain lead paint.
So, well, let's dive into this, Katie.
So I appreciate what Chris was saying there, but it wasn't actually what I meant. So I wanted to clarify what I actually meant. It was about tracking mitigations. It wasn't about tracking whether or not you are vulnerable per se, which I think is potentially a valuable thing as well. It just wasn't what I was talking about. It was talking about format, complexity, depth of how deep is the analysis going to go, in terms of how this looks going forward. There would be, just one example off the top of my head very quickly from my past as a Linux developer was we had a Linux distribution. One of the packages was, had a vulnerability in it, and the immediate communication from us as the vendor to the world was, yes, we will be updating this package. However, you are not vulnerable if you install the default installation because this component is not turned on by default. So that type of sort of meta identification of whether or not the component in the item itself is by default, going to be vulnerable in the way, and that's just one example of that type of additional data.
It's not you are vulnerable, you're not vulnerable. It's a set of contingencies that has to be communicated.
Potentially, and it might be a potential place where additional tracking of that data may be necessary to give you a full picture.
Any of the folks who are responsible for defending organizations have some thoughts about what you'd like to learn, what you'd like to see from a vendor? Tom.
I think that I've been thinking a lot about one of the challenges being the lack of a demand signal in the marketplace for this. When we were starting to bang the drum for structured threat intelligence sharing, we had our greatest success when we finally went around to what I'll refer to as sort of the unusual suspects. So some people in critical infrastructure industries that weren't typically like at sector coordinating council meetings or weren't necessarily part of sort of our the government relations field or anybody else, and went to people who were also practical operational network defense types and got them to start visiting vendor booths and start asking for the things that we were asking for. Because as a government agency, it was easy to sort of, sure, yeah, you want your science project and everybody's products, and that's going to cost us a bunch of money, and nobody's going to buy it, and they don't care. And then we got people to demonstrate that they cared, and it made a very, very big difference, right? Because it proved that more than one customer was willing to break out the pocketbook for this. Here we have a similar problem, but we also have a problem of it is hard to communicate to a network defender, perhaps, or like some CIOs and CISOs absolutely get this. They are in this room. And then a lot of other ones don't even know that this is a thing that they can ask for. Like, what do you mean I can have condiments other than ketchup with my French fries? So I wonder if that's sort of like there is an just like with some of the other projects you've worked on, Alan, like there's a big educational and awareness piece for this with the consumers who should be asking perhaps for a bill of materials or some kind of package documentation, and then coaching them up on how to use that once it's in their environment. I think you can you can get them to connect the dots and draw out the breadcrumbs a bit to have people understand it fairly quickly. But again, this is not something that most people are accustomed to being able to ask for at all.
Alan,
1, 2, 3.
Some of the executive branch agencies were guests to this, but House Energy and Commerce convened a roundtable on this subject with a bunch of stakeholders from medical. And one of the initial answers from hospital CISOs was, we don't have the bandwidth to read this, and we don't want it. And then about 10 minutes into it, like, oh my gosh, this would save so much trouble and cost. So there was a very small learning curve. You were there too. Very small learning curve, but then it went really well. I almost wonder if like a road show across the ISACs would be an interesting little, round table per stakeholder group.
Let's do it.
I'm game.
I will also flag that there are 2 major finance sector security events today, as well as the meeting of the Auto ISAC board. But those 2 sectors have expressed strong interest, and I think we'll be probably coming up with some further ideas. But I like the idea of framing this around an awareness and adoption working group that is focused, maybe on writing a little bit, but really emphasizing on raising awareness and promoting adoption. Is there other things that you guys would like to see as part of that effort or initiative? How does that play with, the solving the problem work? Yes, JC.
I think, speaking as a person who was doing policy work in the government, now selling commercial solutions, I think it's very important that whatever comes out here be vendor agnostic. You know, it's just, there's just been too many situations where there's proprietary data formats, lock-in, you know, like all kinds of acquisition, bad malpractice, because whatever's awesome this year is not going to be awesome 3 years from now. If there's sustainable value and sustainable security, no matter how fancy something is or cool it is, we have to get away from, you know, these proprietary, closed, and vendor-specific standards and formats.
I'm thinking that there's probably strong agreement around this issue, and the other thing I will say is that is one of the benefits of a multi-stakeholder model, where hopefully we have enough vendors that you'll help. And I'll also flag that if you see something like this and don't feel comfortable saying that, you can always come to us at NTIA as the conveners, and we'll work very hard to make sure that, you know, this is seen as a community building exercise and not a brand building exercise.
Well, I was going to comment on Josh's comment about the CISOs not or I don't know how to phrase it, but basically I was one of the CISOs saying I don't want that, but that was in response to the Sbomb being on a PDF, you know, and really it's hard to hear people talking about this as something that's, you know, machine readable and something that could be consumed. I'd love to pull this information into my like CMDB as an example and use it for running queries when I'm hearing about, you know, the next version of Heartbleed or whatever. So that goes back to where I think part of what we have to do here is just simply start doing it. And I want to go back to, you know, my offer from New York Presbyterian to work with a few healthcare specific entities, and I'm thinking medical devices because there's so much visibility there, as well as getting a few hospitals that they are concerned and knowledgeable about this, like Mass General and others, and basically let's try to live through what this might look like so we learn about the challenges with publication, consumption by the consumer, you know, just kind of the whole life cycle that will go with an Sbomb. And I think if we do this, and it becomes a point we can talk about this, it's something that we can share with people and really talk about trying to solve a problem in a tangible, practical way. And there'll be lessons learned that we can use as part of that. But I really think that's something we should do is, in addition to thinking about the standards, let's just try some things now with what we can do now.
Seth?
Seth Carmody, U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Thanks to NTIA for convening this group. Very important things going on right here. I'd like to jump in and second Jennings here, and also offer our support behind anybody who's willing to jump in the ring and actually convene a pilot specifically around medical devices. I know that FDA, in conjunction with their MITRE colleagues, are also have set up a sandbox environment at Mass General Hospital where that may be an appropriate environment. There are some paperworks to fill out in order to make that happen, get your equipment in, and some legal implications, but those can all be worked out. But I'd like to put out that offer, just as Josh had mentioned this morning, that the Commissioner Gottlieb is behind this and tweeted out that the Sbomb effort, not just with NTIA, but also at the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council, this is something that's going to happen. So let's figure out what looks good so that people like Jennings can defend his networks and devices.
And just for those of you who have not been working with NTIA for a little while, one thing that has happened in the past is for organizations that want to bring deep sector-specific knowledge, but also still want to have some of the benefits of this sort of open, broader community. We have in the past partnered with an organization like First.org, where they brought large vendors and national CSERTs, but stayed, it was a joint effort between that and a working group that came out of NTIA, so that at least those in the security research community that weren't members of FIRST could engage. So we're happy to walk through something like that, and perhaps it might make sense to say one of the working groups that comes out of this, future to be determined, could focus on the medical sector, and we can sort of walk through whether there's enough that's in common, lessons learned for other embedded device technologies, or whether it should be sector specific. Thoughts from those of you in the medical space?
So this is Jennings Oski again. I mean, I really, I'm an impatient person. I don't want to wait for the standards pieces to be resolved. I'd rather, just like, I don't want to throw Jim, but like, can we, can we just start planning something and get a few other groups and start doing this? I mean, it just seems to me like there's a problem with people spending a lot of time talking sometimes and not committing to action. And
let's form a working group to try to solve that problem.
So, I've used the analogy of surgery. The first time human beings started performing surgery, they had no idea what they were doing, and it's just by doing that you get better. We were just cutting bodies open, right? So
that's going to be a very interesting expansion of NTIA's role.
So
cybersecurity policy and open surgery. Let's continue this. We have a body here of experts. We have the ability to document what comes off the top of the head. What would this process look like?
Well, so I'm in contact with peer institutions. There are several like Mayo Clinic that are really thinking hard about this. I think between those institutions as the consumers, we need a few medical device manufacturers to say, we're going to try this with you, and we'll identify certain, let's say, device types that are deployed commonly across the institutions, pick a standard, or pick two. We could try two. I don't know. And have some of the folks in this room who care a lot about this, like, I have a good working relationship with Josh, and have us come just basically almost, I envision like a whiteboarding session where we start planning, what does this thing look like? How long do we take to do this and get some results that we can report back out to the community, report out to the folks that aren't here? It's, I don't think much more complicated than that.
Great. You've described what we usually think as a working group. Josh.
So I want to do the whole improv comedy yes and. We don't, for the medical advice we gave in the task force report for what HHS is doing with the Sector Coordinating Council and what you're proposing, we don't need this NTIA process at all. In fact, it could slow it down. And I'm very cautious that we don't do something specific to medical that has to get redone or done differently for everybody else, because we're all going to benefit from this. So I like the federalist kind of approach of a really small experimentation. I also like parallel experimentation for other sectors. The way I've viewed the opportunity in this room and the brain trust on the phone, and anyone else we can pull into this later, is can the FDA, HHS medical action and experimentation that Jennings is willing to help with and I'm willing to help with be informed by bigger picture, broader use cases from this group? So we can do something awesome for healthcare, and I think we're going to do something awesome for healthcare. I want that awesome thing to be transferable to other things, and that's the opportunity in this room.
Katie, two fingers.
So I am all for the idea of running a pilot. I think that will be very instructive, and even if it is in a particular niche space. One thing, if you do run a pilot, would be not just looking at, a hospital or large organization plus some of the vendors who actually have to produce the Sbomb, but the integrators and the deployers. And then what I would also love to see as part of that case study would be time and effort from every single one of the participants, because what I keep hearing is that, we're doing it already in this space, or we're 90% there with the tools that we have, but having that big picture for an entire, organization or a hospital or something like that, that is a very valuable thing. How doable is it from a practical perspective over and over again? How repeatable is it? What additional human resources and process resources would need to be developed in order to make this not just a one-time exercise? So maybe echoing a bit of what Josh was saying is the extrapolation of this, of what you learn from doing that being applicable elsewhere. Anyone can marshal can marshal for a particular outcome, especially if it's just to produce a report. But if that report doesn't also include the level of effort and additional, potentially additional cost to all of these players in it, then we are actually missing a huge part of where my concerns are about the scalability.
That's a good point. Pilots should try to capture all of those lessons. So I want to make sure that we don't lose also the points that Katie raised earlier about some of the overhead communication that we might need to have in a more nuanced and sophisticated bill of materials model. But I want to close out sort of our initial excitement around this healthcare model. Any further thoughts around what you'd like to see, or some scoping, some further insights about what a healthcare and medical device focused working group with a pilot in mind would want to?
I also think the pilot that I wish Sunil hadn't left, the pilot that's 6 years in the making in financial services is not thrown away. In fact, they measured the cost savings, and I think we keep implicitly assuming it's going to be a cost burden. So let's measure it all. Yeah.
And that might be something that we capture in the awareness and adoption approach of being able to document the lessons learned from those who've already done this. I think that could be a good way of trying to capture that, especially if we're thinking about cross-sector approach. Jennings.
Well, just to make some closing comments about the healthcare piece of this. As a healthcare CISO, one of my pet peeves is people saying healthcare is different. I continuously push back on my peers when they say, well, it's different for us. And, we'll talk about medical devices, but if you talk to a CISO from a bank, they'll mention, oh, I've got problems with ATMs and embedded software. And, security problems and security challenges are not unique to an industry. They may be different in some ways, but ultimately the solutions wind up being very common, and at least from my perspective. And ultimately, if we're doing something that's a pilot, this is something we should be thinking about, the sustainability of this and trying to identify barriers to adoption. But I will tell you that the current status quo doesn't scale. I mean, the fact that I have to chase down vendors to understand if there's risk based on a component. I mean, the WannaCry problem Josh mentioned, it's still happening in hospitals around this country because vendors aren't managing patches and whatnot. So ultimately, I think it's very intuitive to me that there's value. We just have to figure out how does a pilot become something that demonstrates value, but also demonstrates barriers and challenges so that we have something that we can learn from.
I've got JC here, but just a reminder for those of you who are watching or listening, hit *1 on the call, and we'll see you and make sure that you get into the conversation.
So I have to say this as someone who has a lot of battle scars from open systems acquisitions. The term pilot is really dangerous and problematic because the pilot, basically whatever mistakes you make in the pilot get baked into whatever you do next, and you can't disavow them. And so I would highly encourage people to think in terms of reference implementation. Right, so we're going to lay down some axioms for what constitutes best practice, which are agnostic, and we're going to do a reference implementation, right, with it goes intas and goes outas. And someone else can do another reference implementation in a different sector. That works fine. You can have a reference implementation for on-prem. You can have a reference implementation for cloud, a reference implementation for IoT. But if you frame it as a reference implementation, that doesn't ossify the idea that this pilot has to become the thing. And that's really, really important.
I was just going to say, at least in my world, I'd hesitate to call it a reference implementation. And I can see your objections to pilot. Maybe the way to say is this is actually a bit of an experiment for, I'm okay calling it anything, frankly, as much as I think the way that at least, my team and I, we run what we call pilots. I mean, we're not afraid to come out the other end and rip things apart because they didn't succeed. So I hear what you're saying. I think, the philosophies aren't different. It's more of, whatever we call this, my commitment is to consider, I think, more of an experimental mode to understand, what are the challenges we're going to face and how do we move this forward. Healthcare isn't doing this. And, or if they're doing it, they're using their own Sbomb. And we're trying to move to here's something that's standardized and rigorous.
So, it's a semantics thing of pilot, phase 2, program of record, right? That's the fear.
No, thank you. For the framing, especially in specific communities, is very important to remember, so we appreciate flagging that. So past couple hours since lunch, we've come up with the idea of saying we're going to look at standards and formats. We're going to think about awareness and adoption and try to capture some lessons learned. We're going to have the healthcare experiment, or however we choose to name that, the pilot, sector-specific, the reference implementation. But I want to loop back to some points that were raised earlier today and that Katie brought up again, which is there are some real challenges with using this data, especially if we want to have this in an automated fashion. So there's the question of, vulnerability versus exploitability. There are some concerns about people saying, I'll tell you most of what I have, but I don't want to tell you everything. Are these issues that you think we should address, that we can address? We can bring a proof of concept, a reference implementation that sort of demonstrates that they're not as big an issue as we might think? Or are there ways that we can tackle them to start thinking about, even if they don't fit in today's standard, we can start thinking about how to include them into tomorrow's discussion? Josh.
Maybe a half step prior to that on my list of potential work streams, there's been I have to go find it, but this has been a 6-year conversation, and early on there was about 20 furious objections levied, and I think 18 of them proved to be unfounded, but they look really good. And even some initial blush responses like Jennings saying, oh, we don't want that, it's too much work. So I had proposed we capture some facts, some fiction, some common objections, or an FAQ of sorts, because what we really want to do is we really want to tackle the hard, persistent, pernicious things that could screw this up, as opposed to spend too much time on the ones that maybe are answerable. So it's not instead of your request, it's just saying let's do a triage of what are the most common concerns and objections. Do we have a good answer or do we not have a good answer? And I think the ones where we don't have a good answer is fodder for more investigation.
Michelle, then Eric.
Yeah, if we're talking about kind of scheduling our next activities, I do want to reiterate a couple of times we've had folks very importantly point out we have to scope and goal this. Not to death, but this type of thing can expand to all kinds of areas, but making sure that everyone is very clear and having a couple of people just focused in on what that looks like, I think will be really important to be able to find an endpoint to this, right?
And I think that actually ties back to the comment I was going to make in response to what Josh was just saying, is that if you have some understanding of what you're trying to achieve, it helps you to understand whether or not the objections rise to the level of a cost that you would say is intolerable, right? So you might say certain objections you could brush away because they're not correct, or it doesn't reflect a full understanding of how this is going to work. In some cases, you may decide that there is a cost that comes along with doing this, but it is outweighed by the benefit, and so you have to have an understanding of what you're trying to achieve in order to be able to net those things out.
Reactions? Katie.
Perhaps a place that will help inform some of the costs would be to do a survey of the intended consumers of this information about what their current costs are for deploying patches. And the reason why it may inform some of the Sbomb efforts is one of the biggest things I think that will be one of the devil details is the frequency of updating it. And the frequency, and I bring that back to the intended consumers of that information, and back to one of my original concerns, which is organizations struggle to deal with the vulnerabilities that they know about today in applying patches, for the vulnerabilities without the subcomponent additional information. So a survey of some of the willing, intended consumers of this information of what they spend now and what they would like to see in terms of, how would this help them? How would this help them with their current, with their current picture? Because I hear a lot of, there's a lot of cost saving that is talked about, but one of the most eye-opening conversations I ever had with a customer when I worked at Microsoft was the fact that they spent about $1 million every patch Tuesday, so every month, on the scheduled, testing and deploying of patches. They wanted to cut that $12 million budget down to $4 million. They asked us to move to quarterly because that's what they wanted to spend, and that was within their sort of risk tolerance. So intended audience, survey them for what they're spending now and what they would like to see out of this. And then I would very much like to see an analysis about what the cost reduction might be in improved efficiency from having this information.
Michelle.
Sorry, I just wanted to, I think that because of the point we are in the maturity of this process, we may need to also factor in the risks of not doing this properly, right? Because I don't know how many organizations actually have efficient and fully vetted patching processes. And one of the things we're trying to do is avoid the big costly consequences of not patching properly. So trying to bake that into that kind of cost metric as well, the cost of having a successful ransomware attack hit your hospital, things like that, or other industry.
Yeah.
In terms of like metrics for success, since we've acknowledged that having like an Sbomb as part of your organization is kind of a sign that you're doing other things right, and also maybe communicating with other organizations, right? The benefit of adopting a standard like this could be kind of emergent and distributed across the whole software development ecosystem and not accrue to any one particular organization. And it'd be interesting to know if there's a way to get an overall metric of, say, the security of the ecosystem based on this standard adoption as an intervention.
We've got 1, 2. Josh.
I don't want to be the referee. Every time we say that we're trying to protect like an end user or operator, I feel like that's the paternalism thing. So just want to caution, like they can choose to ignore it. They can choose what their patch frequency is. They can choose if they want to mitigate it. If we don't give them any information, they can't make the choice.
Yeah, I don't think we have heard a shortage of potential benefits today, but I think we should also be aware of what are some of the challenges.
Yeah, one extra additional benefit, I guess, to follow up to your comment from the industry statistics, we're still seeing over 10,000 organizations downloading known vulnerable versions of struts. And if they didn't learn from, the issue that Joss mentioned from back in 2013, they should have learned from the one that got Equifax and then later, additional ones last year, right? And so as we work to make this more of an accepted best practice, like CI, like CD, the inevitable side effect of that is that everybody else will start paying attention to what's in their software, and hopefully it'll up the game for everybody.
Rob?
Well, you asked if we had something else besides benefits, and so I want to talk about the costs for a second. I come from the world of intrusion detection systems, which don't work. And when I say they don't work is that they don't work as intrusion detection systems. They don't sit there silently until one day it tells you, hey, by the way, there's an intrusion. That's not what they do. What they do is they provide a lot of visibility into the network. They provide forensics data for after an event happens and so on and so forth. So they have a lot of value. They just don't detect intrusions. And one of the reasons is false positives, that a signature will trigger, it's accurate 99.9% of the time, but you have so many packets, you have 1 billion packets go across. So that means 0.1% of 1 billion packets is still 1 million packets that trigger events. And we have the sort of situation here is everyone's saying, hey, look at the JBoss or struts vulnerability. Tell me about that I have it so I can fix it. But what they're not thinking of is the false positives of, when we discuss it kind of on the edges, not in these terms, of I'm getting all daily information. I get 10 new NVDs that say that match up with stuff I've got in my environment. Am I vulnerable? And I don't know. I have 10 things I have to deal with per day that I just basically ignore per day. So the question is can I give you an Sbomb you can match with the vulnerability database that's not more false positives than signal? There's not more noise than signal.
Is there something that this communication would come from the vendor to say, hey, we know this is going to flag it, and it's okay? It's not. This will be a false positive.
Well, what I mean is that if you just get an Sbomb from the vendor and you do the matchup yourself with the vulnerability, it's on the whole it's going to be more noise than signal.
I want to bring in Sunil, who's been doing this for a little while, and then Chris.
Yeah. So what's missing in many organizations is a threat model that connects those pieces together. So yes, I actually want to know all the vulnerabilities. But the filter that we apply is a threat model that says, does it even matter? Just to use another metaphor, you are vulnerable to Ebola, right? I don't think anybody doubts that. I don't think you will question it. However, is it within your threat model that you should be concerned about it? And the answer hopefully should be no. Otherwise, I think most of us would leave this room pretty quickly. But we know that you already have a threat model in your head that would say that is irrelevant. We don't have a similar construct, or many organizations don't have a similar construct where that threat model is available, and thus you can make that decision. Now, whose responsibility is it to create the threat model? And it's not the vendors, it's ours.
Chris?
Yes, so I think when we talk to the timeliness of the update of the Sbomb, if the Sbomb has information from the vendor saying whether it's an issue in the component that's in there is exploitable or not, the timeliness of the update is going to matter. If you have 300 open source components, probably almost on a daily basis, one of those is going to have a CVE associated with it, or at least weekly. So if the vendor is updating you monthly or quarterly, you have this huge period of time that you don't know whether you're vulnerable or not. And different organizations might choose to mitigate anyway. Just say, I'm going to put some sort of mitigation in place, waiting for the vendor. So I think this timeliness of the update of the Sbomb is going to be critical, right? I mean, obviously you'd want continuous. But if it's weekly or monthly, is that really that great? Is it usable still, unless it's a very quick update from the vendor?
So this is a world when, if the Sbomb can convey metadata as well as just the list of dependencies, it can contain metadata, we might need a world where the Sbomb is updated more frequently than the product itself.
Right. If you're going to go on the path of you're a risk-averse organization and you have to mitigate in some other way than wait for the patch. You'd want to know to put a mitigation in place, which is what I'm hearing the critical infrastructure in the medical world would want to do.
Thoughts on that for those who are justifiably risk-averse?
Yeah, the answer to your question is no. Weekly, monthly is not good enough. If you go back to, we want the defenders to be having the same information as the bad guys. Bad guys get it as soon as it's out there. They're not consuming their data on a monthly basis.
Bruce.
Random action. And, we need to stop that. At least in the cases where it's random. We need to stop it always. But, most of the time the random action I've found is don't do anything. At least in our customer base. Because they found out I didn't do anything. I haven't done anything for 25 years or whatever the number's been where they're ahead. And nothing bad happened. I used to do things and disrupted everybody. Sometimes my systems didn't work for 3 days after I applied a patch and didn't help anything. So I stopped that. So we have to address this problem. You're going to get people to adopt it. You have to do it in a way so that they're not going to be jerked around all the time and then find out it didn't matter.
But again, I think any argument that it's better for end users not to have information about how they may be vulnerable is just not really going to get much acceptance. Because if they don't want to read it, they don't have to read it. They may have a contractor who takes care of that for them. It's just, it becomes indefensible at a certain point to do things like, tell system integrators that they can't reveal vulnerabilities in your product to their customers when they know they're there. And so, again, this paternalism really, it should stop. But getting back to the business process, I think the real pain is the shift from batch to continuous process. Right, and in every industry, it doesn't matter whether it's pouring steel or constructing houses, when you go from batch to continuous processes, there are wholesale changes in the industry. You go from, chunks of steel to, rolls of steel coming through the factory, and it never stops. And the processes necessary to adapt to continuous monitoring, continuous integration. I mean, every single large enterprise is going through, some evolution, whether it's comfortable or exciting or painful around this. And there's a skills gap and an HR problem associated with that. But I think that when you get into continuity and you get into automation, that's where this information should be there and then also becomes useful.
I've got 1, 2, 3.
I mean, just going back to the title of this whole meeting today is, software component transparency, and the fact that I don't know what the harm would be to provide that information, as people have said, they can act on it or not, but to provide that information, if you didn't provide it and you knew it and you did not provide that, then at what point does this become a legal issue down the road of negligence or something of that regard, that someone could say you knew this information, you sat on it for paternal reasons, whatever, you didn't provide it, and something happened. Why not disclose if you have that information and let the folks decide what to do with it?
All right. Tom, Josh, Bruce?
So back to our experience just shipping around threat indicators in a structured format, or not a structured format in a lot of these cases, but like this sort of like you have to be willing to ship garbage sometimes just to have a conversation with what your users actually want and what people can leverage. If you want to achieve, if you want more people to achieve the right level of understanding that Bruce, I think you're talking about, like how to actually first you have to tell them a bunch of garbage and let them make mistakes and then blame you for the mistakes, which is where we've been before. And then you learn from each other, right? And then as slowly over time, we've learned how to refine how we, package and ship indicators and the degree of context that people want, and, that there's some stuff that is strictly never useful, no matter how bad we might think it is. And I see that I would imagine that this is going to be similar. Again, as far as that roadshow is concerned, we are going to have to teach people what to expect and what to do and not do with the information.
Josh, then Bruce.
That was a good segue. So if this is the part where we're saying, well, I'm scared of Sbomb, what I'm scared of is there are a few, not too many, but a few that expect to have a completely clean bill of materials, like no known vulnerabilities at all. And I think especially, I said this before, for the older stuff, that's not going to be possible or even economic. And we wouldn't want people doing busy work, I think is a phrase Chris used with me on the phone, at the cost of valuable work. So I think a risk is that if the column 1 for my graphic of the Sbomb itself is only used to create column 2 of a list of potential vulnerabilities treated as actual vulnerabilities, that poor education absolutely could cause busy work. That's why I'm pushing for column 3, which is some sort of rational analysis or attestation that could persist across time and stakeholders.
Bruce, then Jennings.
Yeah, I'm not advocating giving people nothing. I just want to say that what people need is, the understanding. And yeah, it'll take time to get there, and it'll take time for us to understand how to communicate with the different constituencies so that they can get an understanding. But we're not done when we just say, this CVE might be, which is in, against this component that you have in there, might be vulnerable. Decide what you want to do on your own. That's not good enough.
So I just want to, again, reiterate kind of the importance of this from the patient safety perspective. And I've heard some skepticism in the room today, and I get it. You know, there are going to be customers who risk, if let's say we gave all the third-party components, there's going to be customers who don't understand this, and they're going to be a pain in the butt. You know, I get it. But at the same time, thinking about New York Presbyterian or any of our peer institutions, we are critical infrastructure. And when we thought about security 4 years ago, it was HIPAA, and is it laptop encrypted? But we now talk about it in the context of, you know, emergency management, enterprise risk, business continuity, and, you know, I'm working with law enforcement on tabletop exercises around a blended event that brings down our elevator systems in our hospitals, and we can't move patients. And during that event, maybe we have a public health crisis, and we're trying to pivot how we deliver care. This is the sort of stuff that really, you know, this is happening in our country. It's happening around the world where there's really critical events happening, mass casualty events. And the technology we are talking about here, the software behind it, is used during those events. And so we have to have a security program at New York Presbyterian that scales to having available systems during really critical events that affect our country. And it isn't satisfactory to say, well, there might be some customers who don't use this, so it's not valuable. Or there's some customers who, you know, might read too much into this. We're talking about really important stuff, you know, that needs to be there to help critical infrastructure. And this is important, and I think teams like mine can be the sort of teams that actually help us work through these issues and you know, try to identify a path forward for something that's really critical to multiple industry sectors.
Thank you. 1, 2.
So it seems like a lot of the concern is how the recipient of the information interprets it and what the best practice with how to do that is. It seems like that's also something we can solve as a use case. As a receiver of this information, what is the best practice for how I'm supposed to interpret it? Should I expect that there are 0 vulnerabilities, or is it more realistic to expect that the vendor has probably investigated all of them and disclosed the ones they know about and have told me why they think certain ones are not vulnerable, and you know, that information empowers me to do what I want with it. But I think as we publish the standards, we can publish the expected standards for how it's interpreted at the same time.
And I think that may be, I'm just going to jump in, sort of we have a number of you who have wanted to focus on what can we do with what we have today, and then perhaps another area of focus can be, okay, what does transparency look like tomorrow as we sort of build out sort of folks who are using this? How can we add an additional layer of metadata on top of this that can help organizations use it and make sure that they're not inconveniencing the vendors as well with further complexity? I had a point here, and then Rob, and then Eric.
I thought at one point we were focusing on bill of materials, which my understanding is like a statement of some software producer of saying this is what's in our stuff, the list of ingredients. But it sounds like we're also talking about the things saying, you know, warning, aspartame causes cancer in rats, maybe you should be concerned. And that's a different function, and I want to bring it back to an original point that I made, which I think was duly shut down. But it was like, if we're talking about having data available about what components under what conditions are or are not exploitable, what's the incentive structure around building a common knowledge around that, such that we can use that to inform decisions about risk and mitigation?
So I wanted to jump back to the point on understanding versus just having raw information, and that the raw information is better. We have 30 years of experience now with full disclosure, where this issue has been constant, that we give out the raw data of a vulnerability in the full disclosure process, or do we try to give understanding? And we've had this constant problem where vendors sort of corrupt their data. Like, is this a critical vulnerability? Well, they have marketing reasons why they may want to soften that and tell customers, it's not so critical. And so the understanding from the vendor is immediately that they've got other concerns necessarily than what we have as the consumer. And so our 30 years experience with full disclosure is the idea that get the raw data out there first. That's the most important thing. Understanding sort of comes later. And similarly, we've had 150 years of that for crypto. You know, everyone wants to like cover up crypto stuff. You know, the end user doesn't need to know the algorithm details. We can cover that up. And in fact, we find you get the raw details out there because what you're hiding with trying to communicate understanding is any alternative perspective. Your friends may have a different perspective on it, and you're hiding it from them, so therefore they can't get it. So maybe the hospital can't deal with the raw information, but yet the understanding comes from the community, from other companies, from other sources other than the vendor.
Interesting. I like that idea.
Can I respond? Just the hospital can. I mean, not all hospitals can. It's one of the things here is I think we're assuming every customer is the same. But my hospital, hospitals like mine, all the time we review the crypto that's used by a vendor, and we're constantly telling them like, hey, you're using export ciphers, or you're using TLS 1.0. We want you to upgrade to 1.2. I mean, it's part of why I want to see the Sbomb is because we make it part of our procurement process and part of our life cycle for managing the vendor. And the benefit of having big enterprise hospitals like mine doing this is that I think there's trickle down to smaller community hospitals that don't have those resources and capabilities. So that's part of, I think the same thing will happen with medical devices or other software. It could be, the electronic medical record, that we have the ability to drive some of the conversation and to affect basically product design and support and benefit the entire industry, not just our large hospital.
I had a two-finger from Ken.
Yeah, I just want to sort of push back on the myth that vendors have a tendency to twist the truth when it comes to issues like this. Quite the contrary. We want to get this out as fast as possible because we have a liability issue if we tell you something untrue. It's an integrity issue for us as a vendor as well. So this myth of the vendors will twist the truth is you're dealing with the wrong vendors to begin with.
Well, we have some conversation here. I don't want this to devolve into the full disclosure debate. We wandered into that one already, but I do want to get Jen and JC.
So I'm just going to say, I agree with that point about like you're dealing with the wrong vendors. I think there are absolutely vendors who do this. There are absolutely vendors who don't. I think not all vendors are created equally, and we can all probably agree on that.
Oftentimes, it's not their vulnerabilities as written. I mean, most people, 80% of the software in a commercial product is open source. So if there's a critical against some component there, it's not like they're just pulling the score out of the air, where they have like a fudge factor around it. Like it's there. And so, it would create like horrible regulatory and legal problems for them to change that. I think that the disclosure issues become, problematic when people, like either don't disclose what's there or they prevent others from disclosing what's there.
So I didn't want to debate full disclosure, but I did want to point out that your statement, disagree with me, agrees with me. Like one reason why you might distort the information is because of your marketing reasons. The other reason might be for regulatory reasons. You've distorted it the other way. It's like Josh's statement they made earlier, this house may contain lead paint. They don't know whether it contains lead paint or not, but they're making that warning because they have to. And so the same sort of thing happens for risk analysis, is you have to go the other way, maybe say it's more risky than it really is, because if you don't, you'll get sued. So what I'm saying is that the needs of one is not necessarily the needs of the other.
Now, we do that.
We've got a request for you to use the mic if you want to say more than Oracle takes care of.
We do that. We always go higher. If there's any doubt, we go higher. Always.
All right. We've got Josh and then Eric.
It's really a question, not a comment, because I've known you long enough to know when you're sometimes being Socratic or whatnot. Are you saying, with your point about the 30 years of disclosure without having disclosure debate, are you saying we should give the fullest amount of information? Or are you saying we shouldn't? Because earlier it sounded like you were advocating for opaque. Now it sounds like you're advocating for...
No, I'm not...
Not you, Bruce. That's Sarat.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we should or shouldn't. I'm just saying that the argument that the raw details are inappropriate, I think, is never the argument in our community. We've decided in our community transparency. That's the name of this group. We decided that transparency is good. Now, there are other flaws, like to what detail do we give this information, which is the cost versus the vendor, how much use will be. There's lots of other questions, but the one question we should all agree on is transparency is good.
Eric. This is maybe a question for further thought based on what Josh was saying before, but you were talking about how a lot of times that there's a belief in advance that this is going to be a net cost, and yet there are benefits that exceed the costs. How is it that you measure the benefits of the use of this in a way that will help us to understand what costs we should be willing to bear?
I think per stakeholder, because you and I are speaking very similarly, per stakeholder, what's their current pain or cost of operations to call every single vendor? So if you're a hospital operator, and like Jennings had to call all these people and say, are you vulnerable? That had a cost and an efficiency and a mean time to resolution. One of the ones in the room, I'm hoping the Aetna guy will speak to this, but Jim Rouse saved millions of dollars of reduced unplanned, unscheduled rework, and he measures it with engineering KPIs, like very proven, common things. So I think per stakeholder group, you could look at current cost burden, emergent cost burden, that kind of thing. I don't think it's going to be the same measurement across those stakeholders, though.
Yeah, but if we have examples like that prove out the model, then I think it'll be a lot easier for us to, yeah.
This gets back to the point earlier about trying to understand some of the costs and benefits. So as we're coming into the home stretch of today, I'm very impressed at some of the common ground we found, right? You guys sort of figured out that, one, we need to tackle the standard side of things, and we have the independent software vendor and the Linux Foundation coming together, and that warms my heart. There's some real interest, in part because there have been a lot of you participating from the medical sector to say, let's really work for understanding the implementation in this sector. I think those two efforts, I hope, we'll work on coordinating them. There is the issue flagged of this awareness and adoption piece, which I know Tom talked a lot about, sort of first taking this on the road and engaging sectors, more organizations, building a bigger tent. I wonder whether you all think that the discussion of understanding some of the costs and benefits, whether that's the right sort of grouping to sort of think about awareness and adoption to tackle some of the data gathering, whether it's anecdotal or quantitative. Would you like to have those, see those, you know, this is the point where you start to think, how much work am I willing to do to actually find good answers here? This is where we start making eye contact and making everyone uncomfortable. So we're going to flag the awareness and adoption piece. Do we think that is a similar question for understanding sort of the organizational mechanics? Or do we think that should be a separate issue? And then the second thing I want to pose to you is, should there be a group that is not focused on saying what we can do today, but trying to tackle some of the longer term visions of what does transparency 2.0 look like that we can start thinking about now so it can be standardized in a year, so it can be rolled out in 2 years? Do we want to sort of go down that road and try to tackle some of the very hard cases that Katie and Chris and Rob and some others have brought up? Art.
I don't have an answer to your direct question, but looking at the provisional working group ideas, I would suggest that the SWID SPDX one be slightly more genericized to be, existing inventory standards review, what is currently being used, is it working, how much do they talk to each other? That's probably useful to know before we make an uninformed decision about which one to pick. So, okay, thanks.
Good framing, thank you. Kent, you like that? Yes.
Hi, Savannah with TIA. I really, oh, sorry, what?
Remind us of your name.
Savannah Schaefer with TIA. I really liked Josh's idea about pulling together the FAQ of sort of current conversations about SBOMs. And I don't know if that fits under the awareness and adoption piece, but would like to make sure that's kept in.
Michelle.
So who's going to do the scoping and goals? Is that a group or is, because I mean, yeah.
That's an excellent question. In the past, something that we've encouraged is that is the first job as a working group comes together is to come up with a statement of purpose of some kind and figure out how they are going to address the task.
Scoping and goals generally, and like all of these projects fall around us having this scope, right?
Excellent. And I think that's a phenomenal point. So how would you tackle the scoping and goals question?
Well, I would say for the medical device experiment, which we'll come up with a different name because that sounds kind of glib. It sounds problematic at so many levels. But I would say that we'd find some key leaders and we would define what are the scopes and goals, and we would be transparent and share that. I think that's really, it probably is across each one of these. It's specific. I mean, awareness and adoption is.
No, I think we're talking cross purposes. Sorry, I'm now going to put the microphone on. I think we're talking cross purposes. I agree that every group will define its own scope for the project that group is doing. But I think that the original point, and I'm sorry, I'm terrible with names, but I think the point that you were making, Michelle, is that we haven't actually agreed a scope for what Sbomb is.
Oh, okay.
And therefore, having subgroups working on different elements of how we would apply it or what it would look like or how we would adopt it means we're all going to be running in different directions and not speaking a common language.
Well, can I comment just again about the medical device piece? Like I would envision, let's say Jim in Siemens are helping, and we've got some others. We would maybe look at, SPDEs and SWID and say, all right, what do we want to adopt? What seems to make sense for medical device manufacturers right now? And it's an experiment, right? We can pivot. If those things become completely harmonized, we can change, but let's pick something and see where that fits,
Okay.
Does that make sense?
So I'm just going to respond to this really quickly. So that to me makes sense, but I think that there's some really foundational things that we need to create as basic parameters to make sure that everybody who is involved in any of these working groups has a common understanding of what we mean when we say Sbomb. Particularly as, to the point, and again, terrible with names, I really apologize, but, you made the point earlier on that we've had people in the room talking about Sbomb as basically just a list of components, and then we've had other people talking about it as a list of vulnerabilities. And so, while there is, I would say, a pretty broad spectrum of discussion around what this term means, and it's still relatively loaded, that it's going to end up being a situation of I think, relative chaos unless we nail that before we split into subgroups.
Kent.
Okay, my understanding, and this is just mine, it could be mistaken, my understanding is we're looking at third-party components to software packages and identifying those. The vulnerability aspects and all of that other can be used to be built on top of that foundation. But initially, because we want to look at just focusing this, we're looking at third-party components to vendors or software publishers' product.
Art, Seth, Josh, Jim.
As I sort of laid out on my slides, I personally like having the component relationship and the vulnerability mapping, but I do agree with Kent that the first layer of that foundation needs to be the inventory. So I'm reasonably happy with minimum viable product being the ingredients list. The word third party concerns me. I sort of know what you mean, Kent, but just all components. Okay. I don't care if they're third party or not.
That's fine. A third party was just, from my focus,
sure.
Anything the vendor didn't develop themselves, either bought or incorporated from open source.
Right, and I want the things that the vendor incorporated and the things the vendor created. When I'm the final recipient, I want all of the parts. So I want McAfee to include all the stuff that you put into your stuff and the stuff that you create first party.
So just Sorry, just so
pressure, yeah.
Just so I understand, you're talking about you want source file names, you want that kind of stuff, because that won't happen.
No, we can go, so abstraction is important here too, but it can be a couple layers above that. You know, you can give me the Sbomb I get from you can say, I'm going to make up a product name I can't remember anymore. McAfee antivirus version 4.7, 1A3. So there's that.
Right.
And bundled with that is, I don't know, OpenSSL and some other stuff.
Right.
So I don't need your file name level, but I need your, you know, something, what you call a product.
Well, you'll get the product information, you know, at a higher level from the standpoint of product name, product version, any dependencies, and then third-party components, either commercial or open source.
Sorry, I want to keep the flow, but I also want to, yes, I just want to set.
So I find it very interesting, the conversation happening between you two, and this guy is going to be needing whatever you're producing to act on it. So I feel like, from my perspective, at the FDA's perspective, we were using Sbomb to rally around and sort of say, oh, you know, this is a concept, but really in actuality, what it looks like, I don't care, as long as Jennings can use it. Jennings, do you know what you need right now at the moment so that we can properly scope this, or is it something that would come out during a pilot? My point is that, is it something to be figured out, or is it something that we can define right now before we leave the room?
Not today.
Great.
So that was we have the existing standards, we have the pilot. That will tell us what we can do today, or sorry, the reference implementation. And then I agree with you that definitely from an awareness and adoption perspective, what are we promoting awareness and adoption of? But you know, I think we did a good job, or you guys did a good job, sort of saying, well, we're going to limit it to on-premise software for now, and that's something we can also add going forward. But I think the scoping is not going to be solved in the next 45 minutes. We spent the entire day sort of talking through what are the benefits and how could this work. I've got, what was my order there? Josh and Jim, and then we'll just go around.
All right. So regardless,
well, for the today.
I think if you look at your coordinating vulnerability disclosure multi-stakeholder process, we sort of naturally kind of fell into time horizons. So my instinct, and I've never seen this in yours before, is Jim's straw man initial, draft of a three-dimensional thing. My instinct is like a very quick turn of the crank that is useful as a platform for every other project could basically map the current best practice in Horizon 1. Then, just what's the heat map of what people are actually able to do, not theoretically able to do. And then we have the ring just outside of that is what, how you make best practice common practice, right? So some of those tangible, and then maybe the aspirational stuff you call transparency 2.0, but let's do a capture of current, a capture of with minimal effort and maximum reward, what's just outside that. Because if we just look at what's, to your point, the scope could kill us if it's too big, right? You could easily underscope this thing. You could easily overscope this thing. And we're both trying to future-proof the thing and also make sure we don't take forever to get there because hospitals are actively being attacked. So I don't know if there's a way to do like a very quick project that enables the rest of the scope and use cases and exit criteria to be good. I don't know.
We've got JC, then
yeah, so...
you missed me.
Sorry, Jim was next in the queue. Thank you.
No, I just want to be clear in the scope on top. I don't want to pick apart words, but it's more than software packages. And I think you captured devices already there, but it's not just the software packages, but devices.
And this is why I'm going to strongly suggest that the working groups who are going to actually be churning forward focus on that scoping. And as we move forward, we will deconflict that process.
Okay.
JC, then Art.
So Ion Channel has an open standard called a SIVA for what's in it and stuff about it. and nobody's schema is going to be all end all. But I would was happy to share that with anyone so that people can knock the stuffing out of it and say, well, what it's missing or what else would we need? Not even to use ours, but to say, well, something that we would use would have this, but it would also have this, and like, oh, that thing's completely unnecessary, and like, why would anyone think this was useful or whatever? But I could just throw something in the ring to murderboard, and sometimes it's better not to start with a blank sheet of paper. So we can send that to you guys, and you can take it apart, and I'd love to hear what's awful about it.
I'd like to cling to some hope of a little bit of scope coming out of the room here. This is maybe the last time I'll try, but right. We almost got down the rat hole of what level of granularity. Kent was suggesting, lines of source code, and we asked an end user, what they would want. We're not going to solve that today. Understood. No argument there. But even if we say we're only doing the list of ingredients and it is box product, and that can include devices, even if we could agree on that, which I'm not sure we can, but if we could do that today in the room, we're a lot further off, down the road than otherwise. So that's I guess I'll put that as a proposal.
So we're going to have you repeat that.
Yes, I'll speak it slowly.
Yes.
A proposed high-level scope is, I'm going to just say box products to include devices. So services are out. And what else did I just say?
List of components?
Yes, we stick to the list of material, the list of ingredients, list of components, and I will delay my wish for component relationship, perhaps, and vulnerability mapping as add-ons.
All right.
That's a proposal. I'm not saying
thoughts
done deal.
on
So
that
shoot at that.
Scoping. Jen, do you have a thought on that scoping? Okay.
I have a question about the scope, actually. It's very specific to this. Is there not going to be any discussion on how this is shared? It's just saying this is what a component list looks like? Because it seems like there's more to this, because I guess you're going to get that in the standards and how it's written, but so if I understand what we're saying, we're just creating a format to create what has previously been called an Sbomb, but we're not creating any way of sharing that or compiling that or any. I'm just asking because I've heard.
So what is the model, what does the action of transparency look like?
Are we just stopping at a template, or is there actually going to be some kind of process involved around it as well?
Great question. I think we want to have, Kent, you've got 2 fingers high in the air.
Okay. So part of at least what was thought about before this and in some other forums was to have both the format and a suggested way that we could distribute this. The suggested way to distribute it would probably end up being a working group. Because there is some other pieces that have to be sort of brought into play to make that available. So thank you for bringing that up. That was one thing that we did want to try to think about from the standpoint of creating a working group around distribution of these and availability of these. Normally, though, the intent of the box product is this is incorporated in the box. So that bill of materials goes with the product, and it's always there and it's always updated when changes occur.
Jim, Bruce, Josh, anyone else? And sorry, you keep doing this to me, so sorry.
So to Art's definition about the scope, about box products, in our cases, they're going to be really big boxes, okay? But to answer what Seth was saying before, I agree with Jennings that we could, if we sit down for a day with a whiteboard, we can get to the answer of what we want to go.
Jen, there is one.
So I have 2 requests. One is that can we get some specificity of what we mean by a list of components? Like, is that just what's in it? Is it what version it is? Is it like just a little bit of specificity around what that means? Or like capture it as a question that needs to be answered by the working group.
Yes, exactly.
And then that would be my second request, is that I get that we don't want to do a broader scope right now and that we want the working groups to come up with them, but maybe what we could do is look at Jim's slide and agree a set of questions that the working groups are all going to answer in their scoping, so that we can make sure that we're all at least scoping to the same requirements.
Which slide of Jim's?
That one right there.
Yes, so that for all working groups should directly refer to that slide.
But like maybe we could actually just pull out some questions that come off it and capture those questions so that the scopes all address those questions.
Okay, start.
Sure. So some of them you've already discussed around things like is it devices or software? Is it stuff that's on-prem or as a service, and like you've already addressed some of those already. The time frames, I think, is a critical one. I think like what information is being shared, like is it versions, is it known vulnerabilities, is it whether or not a thing is still supported, like that seems like a pretty fundamental thing. So like
You
just
want us
like
to go back to
capturing
the
those
discussion
questions.
to resolve now what information should be shared? Or?
No, I'm not saying that we need to answer those questions now. I'm saying that what I think would be a sensible idea is if this group agrees a list of questions that the working groups will then make sure are covered when they come to scope, so that at least everybody is scoping on the same requirements.
I think it's a great idea. We don't have a list of working groups yet, but I think that's a great idea. We should come up with both of those. Josh has thoughts.
I don't know if I was supposed to be next or not, but I was trying to answer with this model, a single sentence, scope statement. Now we're kind of changing it when we say boxed stuff, but if I were to say what I see happen pretty routinely in financial services and on the part of some medical device makers, it's all software components for the depth dimension, pretty routinely. It's component name, major and minor version for the breadth one, pretty consistently, and it's with each update pretty consistently. So if I were to heat map it, instead of just talking about heat mapping it, the heat map I see is that intersection as a common practice. So that could be a phase one scope. And I didn't say the trio that you're expecting me to say for Josh Corman Bingo.
I don't know what you're I've never heard of Josh.
So, sorry, Josh, can you narrow that down to a single sentence?
Yeah, I will repeat
we can't see our notes anymore.
If we only use the 3D solution space, which I told you I wanted to improve, but the current heat map of common activity is all software components on the depth dimension, component name with major and minor version on the breadth continuum with each update. So that's the any update middle of that line for the time dimension. That's what I see is the most common behavior for current SBOMs.
And I want to get to Michelle, but first we have Steve Lipner on the phone. And Steve, I'm sorry, I did not see you earlier.
Actually, that it was like 15, 20 minutes ago that I hit star once. So I think I may be well out of sync. I think at the risk of taking the what was referred to as the paternalistic perspective, I think the high priority, and this is consistent with what somebody said. One of the user folks said. I think the most compelling scenario I've heard this morning was the person who said that he asks his suppliers to demonstrate that they have a software bill of materials for the software that they're delivering to him, and if they don't, then he uses that as a negotiating point because he knows he's going to have additional risk and additional work to do downstream if he actually buys that software. And by the way, not buying it might be a pretty good idea. So I feel like that's a very compelling use case and scenario. sort of beyond that, I get confused about what folks are actually going to do with a bill of materials if they have it. Maybe in some cases they can protect themselves. I think a pilot is a good thing to demonstrate the value of the bill of materials to the end user community.
Thank you.
So, Steve, that was Sunil Yu who made that comment. And then let me follow up with that. I sent Megan to your email address a diagram. I'm not sure if you can show it. Okay. So, it's all right. The diagram I created for Megan was one that there's, imagine just for sake of easier, being able to see this a little easier, imagine just a two-dimensional diagram for a moment. In that two-dimensional diagram, we'll draw a box that basically represents what the vendor is willing to offer as it relates to some of these parameters, okay? But then what the buyer wants is bigger than that, all right? The size of that box that the buyer wants represents our minimum risk tolerance for some system that we care about. And that box may be bigger if the impact or the criticality of the system that we're buying is of sufficient thresholds. So there's a certain box that represents the volume of how much we care, okay? And in theory, the vendor should exceed that, but oftentimes today they come short of it. So there's a smaller box in terms of what the vendor offers today that creates a concern for us because we do not have the information that we need as it relates to the software bill of materials and so on and so forth. And so the difference between what the vendor offers and what we're asking for, that's the opportunity for us to drive concessions from the vendor as it relates to, since you can't meet our needs, this is what we want you to concede as far as the negotiations are concerned. The main thing I wanted to point out, though, was the size of the box that is expected from the buyer is really driven by our minimum set of expectations around what the impact of a system. Okay, so if there is a system that is truly, if it goes down, our bank goes down, okay, then we're going to actually ask for a lot more just because it's so important to us. We're going to want it in real time with every possible attribute.
There's a lot of context. All software is not equal.
That's right. So know that that's a variable set. I think to Josh's point about what is the minimum expectation, I think he hit it right on. That the minimum expectation is what he mentioned. Any update, major version, all software components. But know that from the standpoint of our risk tolerance for certain other types of applications, it may be much greater than that. But at the same time, we may say, you know what, this piece of software really doesn't affect us that much, and we may want to have a smaller one. And so it's going to vary. But to Josh's point, that's a great minimum standard that we should start with. It's going to change.
Thank you. Michelle.
I just want to go back to Josh's proposal. I agree those things are very important, and I like the slide a lot. But if I want to come back to what we were discussing, which is the scope, I would caution against trying to incorporate time if we're just looking at a template and a method of delivery, unless the time is how often you're delivering an updated Sbomb, for lack of another word previously called Sbomb. If we look at what the scope of any initial project would be, the depth and the breadth. If you start bringing in how often you're going in to patch, that often becomes you look confused.
So, just the time seems to be coupled with the method of delivery. Right, on this chart, it is either in real time is independent and everything else is coupled with this type of delivery.
It
is your slide. You can.
Is this the delivery of the patch or the delivery of an updated Sbomb? Because I thought it was.
It's the delivery of the
patch. Oh, okay. All right. Now I understand. Thank Thank you.
Wait, I'm confused because I thought that the time was anytime the software itself was changed on the system, which would then include the Sbomb. So at initial delivery, at major update of the product, at when it's patched, all of those are times when you're going to get new software and a new Sbomb.
So this is how often to update the Sbomb, delivery of software, updates of software, real time.
Okay.
Fair interpretation? Happy? Yeah. Which is to say, are they going to be coupled or independent? And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge, but from a scoping perspective, maybe something that a group would want to tackle, you know, the 2.0 versus what we have today. Further concerns about scope. Bruce.
Art was going to give up on components within components, which he calls, I think, relationships or something. And I think we ought to keep that one. And that's based on our experience in building these things internally. Because sometimes you'll see that a component like Log4j is put in for itself in the product, and sometimes you'll find out that it's inside something else. And if you just say Log4j, then you don't know that it needs to be updated multiple times, or not at all, because the component went in already figured out that it wasn't exploitable or something like that.
So yeah, I mean, at this point, the full transitive dependency tree is something you can have pretty easily if you're in a CI/CD pipeline and you have a platform behind it. It's like a solved problem now.
Shall we leave that as a tentative, potentially including? Excellent. I want to go back to the list of ways that we are going to tackle this. And again, the way we think about working groups is this is tentative, this is the initial approach. Folks can say, hey, we thought we would go and do work on this, but it turns out we don't want to, we're too busy. People may come in 3 weeks from now and say, before the next meeting and say, we think this is an issue. So this is not definitive, we're not bound to this, but this is how we can start getting our feet under us on this particular topic. Katie.
Can we go back to the slide with the...
Yes. The notes. Do we have the list of working groups? Sorry, that was the... Oh, sorry, we need to escape the slide. Sorry. Yes.
Well, it's because I have a question about it. Okay, so those are the working groups. Awareness and adoption, is that working group, because I knew what it was, that working group, I knew what that was for during the CVE multi-stakeholder. But what is that working group for in this context? I don't understand.
Kent, do you have a thought?
Yeah, my thought's like hers. It is a little confusing, especially if you're doing a standards review and trying to map best practices is in a different working group that's part of the standards aspect. So awareness and adoption, might be a review of what is actually occurring today with the various formats and options that we have.
So it was my attempt to try to capture Tom's approach, which is let's have a slightly bigger tent than just the folks who are in the room. The emphasis on understanding lessons learned today from what's been going on, and this was some folks made the point of, people like Sunil has been doing this for a while, mapping Katie's question about existing costs, other questions about trying to map existing benefits, capturing that in a single working group as a catch-all for these issues. I'm more than happy to pull those back out.
Okay, well, then, if that's what the awareness and adoption working group is for, I think that an additional bullet point should be the attempt to determine whether or not this will actually help people become more secure based on some of the surveys of what's occurring today and existing costs. When I look, there was a recent study, it was Kenneth Security did a study in 2017 that looked at patch strategies, remediation strategies. So looking at two factors of coverage and efficiency. Basically, you'd obviously want, in an ideal scenario, you want 100% coverage of applying, known patches and 100% efficiency, but they looked at it prioritization based on CVSS score, and then they looked at prioritization based on just targeting vulns for the biggest vendors. And they found that actually using a random just rolling the dice on which vulnerabilities to patch ended up being as efficient as just a strategy of patching, maybe every CVSS score of 7 and above or something like that. So the whole point, if that's what awareness and adoption is, we should be examining the question of, will this make a difference? Will this actually make people more secure?
No, I think the Michael Royko's work on showing that patching is a function of using either a particular company's special sauce or just as an exploit in the wild is the best option. Don't want to devolve to a patch strategy question. Yes?
Well, I mean, that same study shows that if a known vulnerability in either Metasploit or ExploitDB was like 30 times more likely to be exploited. So
how dare you?
Just proving all the great service that free open source project of Metasploit provides. But I mean, efficacy totally matters, and I think that's part of what, Tom left the room, but the awareness and adoption discussions per FSI SAC or per sector is to see which value is being derived from the experimentation or which concerns there are, but also, to your point, the FAQ, so we make sure we're getting past the superficial stuff.
Just trying to recap something that I think I heard, which is that on the awareness and adoption question, that while you were trying to get at what Tom had been talking about how do we actually drive future adoption and make it easy for people who don't necessarily naturally get it and all that kind of stuff, which I think is a really, really great goal. But what I'm hearing from people in the room is sort of a concern that that's premature for where the project is right now, given the other working groups. And the things that you were talking to and other people in the room were talking to as being benefits that we could do right now is much more about capturing case studies, it sounds like, of people who are doing it today. So maybe to create a little bit of clarity and get rid of some of the confusion, we just rename the group to being something like a case study group. Yes. And then it's much more about capturing what the benefits are people are seeing today, if they are seeing benefits, what the hurdles have been, all that kind of stuff.
Great. I like it. Yes.
I just want to say that I like the fact that we're scoping it to, or it seems like it's a fact that we're scoping it to a list of components and not the warning labels, partly because my sense from my own experience with the NVD stuff is part of the reason why CVEs are hard to use is because the CPEs are really hard to map to anything useful. And since we've already heard that CPEs to software components are linked in with SPDEs, like if we solve that problem, then we've done something which actually makes NVD more useful.
Great, thank you. Bruce, you have a microphone on. I couldn't tell if I've just been ignoring you for a while. Thanks.
Yeah, I just want to make an editorial comment about surveys right now, and I'm not saying this to be difficult or anything, but throughout the American history in terms of regulating behavior, whether it be through industry-adopted regulations or I should call it self-regulation, or through government regulations, people have tried to play off two sets of costs. One is social costs against kind of the cost of implementing the technology or something like that. And that was done. I used the example earlier today. Seatbelts. Auto manufacturers talked about the cost of implementing them and the impact it would have on the ability of people to buy cars and all these things. And ultimately, that was just a way of avoiding doing the ethical thing. And I really want to stress that this isn't something we're going to be able to prove the value of early on in this. People don't even know what Sbomb is, right? And people patch poorly right now. So, this is about trying to change how people do things and change the awareness around information security and practices. And frankly, I'll speak from experience. Ramping up security programs at hospitals, it's messy, it's ugly, and we spend a lot of money that's wasted initially because I'm trying to change a lot of behaviors and things. It's not efficient, and it gets efficient over time. And so as we talk about that, I'm not opposed to doing surveys and things and looking at current state and looking at metrics, but let's acknowledge this is a long game, so to speak. This is not something that's going to take effect in 6 months.
Excellent. So we have 11 minutes left. First, I want to make sure that if there's anyone who's watching or on the phone, please do chime in. We're going to make sure that we capture it. I'd like a couple more quick comments on working groups, your last chance to throw something on the board. Then we're going to sort of see there are folks in the room that want to take a leadership position, and then we're going to talk briefly about moving forward in terms of timing and scheduling and all that fun logistical stuff. Seth.
Kind of a working group, but not within this group. I just want to make a shameless plug for the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council's newly announced Sbomb effort. That's healthcare specific. That's healthcare sector specific, so we don't want to Josh's earlier point, that we want to make sure that that has sufficient informative folks in there that doesn't miss broader opportunities and just focusing on healthcare. One of the things that we didn't talk about in here that pertains to healthcare gets back to our boxed example is, does EHR fall into that category? So those are the kind of things we don't want to miss out of studying this group, just because of the folks that we have that are willing, that will get captured in healthcare but will not be talked about in this group necessarily.
Thank you. And I think the deconflict and collaboration is something that we can work through to make sure that there's productive work going on, but we're not duplicating anything. Art.
So, so case studies, proposed notional working groups, case studies, what's going on today. There are some examples we've heard today about what people are doing something and it's working, gathering more participants. Okay. Standards review, what standards exist today?
And Kent, is the goal here to see if we can sort of lay out, here's how this can be done with what we have today?
Okay.
So standards review and
feasibility.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I would propose another working group, or it might replace the transparency one, and I'll call this a scope working group. So I still like the idea of having a little bit of consensus today at a high level, but there could be more thought about scope, right? We haven't got the granularity level yet, right? We haven't got the size of the box, the 3D box. There's been like 5 different discussions about what size the box should be. So a scope working group could at least propose some things, and maybe where a boundary line is between feasible and what the stages you talked about time earlier. So. And that might incorporate the Transparency 2.0 one as the future.
Scope for today and tomorrow as a Disneyland-esque name. I don't want to lose the thoughts that came out today, which is there are some complexities. But keep going, I'm sorry.
No, basically that's it. I think I would maybe call it a scope working group, and the way I'm thinking about it, Transparency 2.0 would be part of that. Again, just talking out loud, right?
Great. Michelle.
I thank you for putting that on the board now, because I've been trying to actually get a scope working group on there when I keep talking about that, but I would also add scope and goals, because what happens is after working in standards for the number of years I have, people conflate goals and scopes all the time. So if you have them both in one working group, they can kind of separate them out where they belong. So you have a scope and a goal coming out of the same group of people. I think would be really important.
All right, Josh.
Since Seth's actions are going to impact my business sooner than probably this working group will, and since several people have flagged some operational challenges like residuals or people expecting a clean bill of health, could we maybe nest under the case studies? It's not just case studies, but also like a running list of concerns. And sometimes you get triaged into an FAQ, like, oh, I understand your concern, here's a good answer for it. And some of them are going to be, here's a concern we don't have a good answer for, but I don't know how to label that one. But I don't want to wait till like phase 3 of this to actually solve real-time problems.
Ken,
we did have the thought of having a challenges and external concerns working group, which was looking at edge cases and some of the problems that we're going to sort of come up with, which may be similar to what you're looking for. It could be incorporated into one of those.
And Art, does that fit in the scope issue of sort of the possible, how do we address future concerns and complexities? Or where does that issue fit? Something that's been on the table for all day. So the concerns that should be addressed.
Perhaps in the transparency 2.0, because edge cases might drive too much.
Katie.
It seems like scope and goals is going to eat the other working groups because everybody is going to want to be involved in scope and goals, right? So maybe that is literally the only thing we do as next step, just as a suggestion.
Does anyone want to do things other than scope and goals?
Yeah.
I do see what she's saying, though, right? If we're going to have a scope for all of these things, right, you kind of have to define it early. And it's not that the other things can't start, but the scope and goals one needs to happen soon and be done soon, right? Right? Doesn't it?
Yes, I think that should certainly be a priority. I know for a fact that there are people in this room who want to do work now.
Well, we're going to do work now. Let's just be very clear about it.
You can use scope and goals to have a very productive discussion. I am not convinced that scope is something that, unless it is a high level, it's going to depend on what we have, the tools, if you want to do it today, or how you want to talk things through in the future, or gathering data. I feel these are all separate enough activities, but if you think that they should all be conditional and we shouldn't move forward on any of them, suggest it.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily conditional. I just think that it's going to be a little bit inefficient. Perhaps the case studies could be done in parallel of surveying what's going on right now, but that it would then inform the scope and goals, right? I think maybe a bullet point to add under scope and goals of what would be covered would be anti-goals. So making sure that, whatever it is that gets created doesn't do certain things, and then the last thing that I would suggest going under scope and goals would be frequency, and that is going to be actually quite important. The frequency of whatever it is that ends up being scope.
So we have 3 minutes left. We have the folks who are going to do the standards and readability. We've got our leaders there. Katie, would you like to be one of the people behind the scope issues, scope and goals?
Sure.
Is there anyone else who would like to be the co-chair?
Oh, no, you said behind.
Okay.
I was listening to you. No, I mean, here's the thing. I definitely would want to be involved in that one.
And forgive me, I'm going to cut you off. I'm looking for folks, and again, if the folks in this room don't have the time and bandwidth to volunteer to be co-chairs, that's okay. Is there anyone who would like to volunteer to be a co-chair of case studies, medical device pilot, scope and goals?
Medical device.
Medical device.
I was going to say that.
Michelle, Jennings. Anyone else? Case studies? Josh. Jim?
I'll go in on medical devices with Jennings.
Fantastic. Anyone else for case studies? We will find that. All right, we are running perilously close to penalty time. Can you pull up the NTIA slides?
Point of order.
Yes.
Okay, so just as a logistics going forward, in past NTIA multi-stakeholder processes, we have had a mailing list that you can then send various information to, so that folks could have these kinds of quick conversations as we organize. But once we organize, then we create the lists for the individual working groups themselves and whatever mechanism we're going to use to coordinate. So is that the process we're going to use now? And
that is the process we're going to use now. Okay,
so if so, then some of these conversations about the initial working group setups can also happen on that major mailing list.
Yes, that is the plan. So what I wanted to do in the last minute is to say we want to make sure that this is something that we can continue the conversation moving rather than scheduling things ad hoc. So the next in-person meeting we currently have reserved to be right here November 6th. Before that, we will have a virtual meeting the week of September 17th, sometime that week. We'll be publicizing this, so if there are things going on that week that we absolutely should not conflict with, obviously this is a group of illustrious, important people. No one is going to be free all the time. But we'll try to schedule something for that week. That will be slide share, conference call, probably 3 hours-ish long. We'll see how short we can make it. Have another virtual meeting after the holidays, another in-person meeting in the spring. If people say, no, we would like a different schedule than this, or you would like to meet in person, not in DC, we can talk about it. This is something that we want to go where stakeholders are. We want to make this as useful and as productive as possible. But we also want to make sure that we keep moving forward from a progress perspective. So we're going to send out a summary of this, the slides, the description of the working groups. I'm going to reach out to some people who did some of the talking to do the initial refining. Once we build up the consensus, each group will sort of further refine their own mission. But we are going to make sure that this is something that can happen together. NTIA is here to be a resource for you. If we can help with call bridges or helping with document drafting, we are very eager to. If you know how to run your working group, that's okay too. We don't want to impose ourselves, but we're here to help. And finally, I want to thank Megan for all of the work documenting things today. And much more importantly, I want to thank all of you for showing up. We don't agree on everything, but I'm really impressed at how much progress we made today. So thank you, and I hope you feel that you did a lot of good work today. And thanks to those of you watching the webcast.